You might not believe it, but the filthiest people of the Middle Ages were the ones who kept society from collapsing. Their lives were soaked in death, waste, and disease, performing tasks most townsfolk refused to acknowledge. Each profession hid a truth. History tried to bury a place where survival demanded pieces of their own bodies and minds. Just when you think you've seen the worst, another shadow opens. Tonight you will step into a world no one dared to face. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, adjust the pillow to fit your head, maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere, and let's begin this journey together tonight. If you were to step into a plague-ridden street during the height of the epidemic, the first thing you would notice would not be the cries of the sick, but the slow, steady movement of men carrying bodies wrapped in worn cloth. They moved without urgency, not because they were indifferent, but because exhaustion had carved itself into their bones. These men were known as corpse collectors, and their work began at dawn and ended long after darkness returned. Every alley, every cramped home, every boarded window could be hiding a body waiting to be taken away. The task was simple to describe but unbearable to perform. They lifted the dead onto wooden carts, sometimes one by one, sometimes stacked in layers when the disease overwhelmed entire households. No one rushed them because no one wanted to come near them. They walked through the streets, as if made of smoke noticed only when the wind shifted enough to bring the smell of decay closer. There was no protective gear, no barrier between their skin and the bodies they touched. Many wrapped strips of cloth around their mouths, but these thin covers did nothing against the sickness floating in the air. The collectors knew the risk, yet they continued each day because the city demanded it. Without them, bodies would rot in homes, in wells, under staircases, or simply in the road. They earned little, barely enough to feed themselves, yet they were expected to keep the streets from collapsing under the weight of death. Most did not survive long. A few weeks of labor were often enough to seal their fate. Illness found them, quickly leaving no mercy. Their deaths were rarely recorded, and their names rarely spoken again. The carts they pushed were darkened by fluids that had seeped through cloth and wood alike. The wheels left marks on the ground lines that told the silent story of how many houses had lost someone that day. The smell that surrounded them clung to everything. Their hair, their clothes, their skin. Even after washing, even after burning the garments they worked in, the odor persisted. People crossed the street to avoid them, not out of cruelty but out of fear. Children were pulled away. Market stalls were suddenly quiet, and doors shut when the collectors approached. They had become symbols of the plague itself, walking reminders that death was never far behind. Inside the small homes where the poor lived, the collectors often found bodies left untouched for days. Families were too afraid to remove them, or too sick to move. Sometimes the collectors arrived to find more than one person still alive, barely breathing, lying next to the dead. They carried out the bodies even as the living watched, unable to speak. There was no ceremony, no prayer, no farewell. The goal was only to remove the dead before the disease spread further. The bodies were taken to mass pits outside the city, lowered quickly, covered with earth and forgotten. The collectors rarely had time to look at the faces of those they carried. After hundreds of bodies, the individual disappeared, leaving behind only the weight. The sight of piled corpses became ordinary. Some days the collectors lifted so many that their arms trembled before noon. The carts filled faster than they could empty them. Rats followed closely, sensing the promise of easy food. The disease did not discriminate. It took the young and old, the wealthy and the poor. Yet the collectors worked mostly in the poorest areas, where homes stood too close and air barely moved. Entire streets would fall silent overnight, and by morning the collectors would be pushing their carts through them, gathering what remained. Illness spread through touch, through breath, through anything that carried the scent of the dead. The collectors breathed it in, daily handling, clothes soaked in sweat, blankets stiff with fever, hair tangled with filth. Many started coughing within days. Some collapsed while working only to be collected by others in the same profession. There was no apprenticeship, no training. Anyone desperate enough could be hired, and desperation was plentiful. Hunger, fear, and poverty pushed men into this work more reliably than any promise of pay. What made their labor even more grim was how unremarkable it became to the city. People learned not to look, not to think, not to ask how many bodies passed before noon. The collectors moved like a necessary shadow. Without them, the plague would have eaten the city whole, yet no one thanked them. They were tolerated, only because the task had to be done by someone. When they died, others took their place, repeating the cycle until the epidemic burned itself out. There were days when the collectors saw faces they recognized, neighbors, friends, or people they had spoken to only the day before. They lifted them without pause because hesitation meant risk. The plague demanded speed, not kindness. Some collectors whispered that the dead were luckier spared from the next day of suffering, but most said nothing. Silence was their only companion as they pushed their carts through alleys where life had already begun to disappear. Standing in those streets today, one might imagine the quiet was peaceful, but at the height of the plague it was heavy and merciless. Doors were bolted, windows covered, and smoke from burning clothes drifted across rooftops. The collectors walked through this stillness, carrying reminders of how fragile a city could be. Their presence was the only sign that someone still tried to prevent complete collapse. Yet they themselves were treated as disposable, valued only as long as they could continue lifting bodies. Even now, historical records speak more of the plague itself than of the people who handled its dead. The collectors remain unnamed, unclaimed by society, buried in the same pits as those they carried. Their work kept the city standing, but the city gave them nothing in return. It is unsettling to imagine how many lives depended on men who were never seen as part of the living world around them. Their story is one of necessity, not recognition, and one that reveals how easily a society can overlook those who protect it at its darkest hour. The streets they walked through were shaped by loss, and their labor revealed truths most people refused to see. The silence they left behind carried into places untouched by their carts, and somewhere in that silence lies another task no one wished to claim. The washyards of Victorian towns rarely appeared in travel sketches or public descriptions, yet they operated every day behind wooden fences stained by years of chemical steam. Workers arrived before sunrise, stepping into narrow alleys that led to sheds filled with large wooden vats. These vats did not hold clean water or any substance a passerby might expect. Instead, they were filled with human urine, collected from private homes, pubs, and street-side pots, emptied by collectors each morning. The men who tended these vats were known only by the nature of their work, and even that name was spoken quietly, as if the occupation itself was something indecent to acknowledge. The yards smelled sharply long before a worker reached the entrance. The odor clung to the air, with an acidic bite cutting through the soot and coal smoke that normally dominated the industrial districts. Workers stepped through the gates with an expression that came from repetition, not acceptance. They knew what awaited them: long hours standing over vats whose fumes reddened their eyes and irritated their throats within minutes. Their clothing, already worn thin, absorbed splashes and smells that never washed out. Even after attempts at cleaning the fabric carried remnants of the yard, marking them in public long after they had left their shift. Bleaching cloth with urine had been practiced for generations, and no one questioned the logic behind it. The ammonia formed by the stored waste helped whiten the fibers, making dull fabrics appear cleaner and more valuable. Merchants and factories needed this effect to satisfy growing demand. Machines had increased production, but nothing replaced the need for manual bleaching. The workers filled this gap, stirring heavy cloth with long poles, lifting wet bundles, and pressing them repeatedly to force the liquid through every thread. Their days were dictated by the smell of ammonia, the heat rising from vats warmed by fires beneath them, and the steady repetition of movement that strained their muscles. The men who worked here came from the poorest districts, often taking the job only because no other work remained available. Many had families to feed and debts to settle. Others had been rejected from factory floors because of health issues or injuries. The washyards accepted anyone willing to endure the conditions. Desperation became the main qualification. Once hired, workers rarely lasted more than a few years before illness or exhaustion forced them to stop. Skin problems were common. The constant exposure to liquid burned through the outer layers of their hands and forearms, leaving them raw and cracked. Some developed infections that spread quickly in the damp environment. Inside the yard, every activity took place in cramped rows of vats. Workers knew not to lean too closely as the fumes could overwhelm them. Yet despite this caution, accidents occurred frequently. A slip on the wet boards could send a man into a vat, and though others rushed to pull him out, the exposure left lasting damage. Some workers collapsed from dizziness without warning, their bodies reacting to fumes that their lungs could no longer tolerate. The foreman rarely stopped operations. If a man could not stand, he was carried outside. If he recovered, he returned. If not, another worker took his place by the following morning. The city pretended that the washyards were simply part of the necessary industry. Well-dressed citizens purchased bleached cloth without considering who had handled it or what substances had produced its whiteness. Fabrics used for dresses, table linens, or even children's garments often carried faint traces of the process, though no one noticed. People cared only for the appearance of hygiene, not the reality behind it. Washers became invisible laborers, essential but unacknowledged. Their presence on the streets was met with discomfort. When they walked home, others avoided their path, not entirely out of cruelty, but because the smell acted as a reminder of work most preferred not to imagine. The washers themselves understood that social distance was part of the job. They learned to speak little to keep their eyes down, and to accept that some people moved aside when they approached. It was not unusual for landlords to refuse them rooms, or for shopkeepers to hesitate before serving them. Even their families struggled with the lingering scent that clung to their hair and skin. Some workers slept in sheds near the yards to spare their households from the discomfort. Others washed repeatedly in cold water or scrubbed themselves with harsh soap, though neither method fully erased the odor. The monotony of the work also wore down the mind. Each day involved the same motions, the same smells, the same silence, broken only by the sound of poles stirring, presses squeezing fabric, and vats steaming. Workers seldom spoke during their shifts. There was little to say, and the fumes made conversation difficult. Instead, they focused on enduring the hours until they could leave. Time passed not through events, but through the gradual fading of daylight across the yard's high wooden walls. Despite its harshness, the washyard was considered necessary for the textile industry. Without bleached cloth, factories could not meet demand, merchants could not supply shops, and households could not obtain the clean, crisp fabrics they desired. The washers kept the system functioning, even though the city never recognized their contribution. They were treated as tools rather than people, valued only for the tasks they performed. Their health diminished steadily, yet no one recorded their names or histories. A washer could disappear from the yard for days or weeks without anyone asking what had happened. The true weight of the profession rested not in the odor or physical strain, but in how thoroughly it consumed the individual. A man who worked long enough in the yard found that his identity slowly blended into the routine. He was no longer seen as part of the community, but as an extension of the work itself. His presence spoke of waste, poverty, and necessity. His absence went unnoticed. Even his death caused little disruption. In the end, the story of the urine washer reveals how Victorian society balanced progress with neglect. The city celebrated its growing industries and expanding markets, but the human cost behind those achievements remained hidden. The whiteness of the fabric symbolized cleanliness, yet its creation depended on environments that marked and damaged the workers who labored within them. Their days unfolded in silence, their labor absorbed by a world unwilling to acknowledge the truth behind its comforts. The cloth they prepared moved into homes untouched by the misery behind its making. And beyond the reach of the washyards, another profession faced filth far more dangerous than any vat of waste. The work of the sewer diver existed far below the attention of ordinary citizens, carried out in tunnels that most people preferred not to think about. These tunnels snaked beneath the streets in narrow, uneven passages where daylight never reached. The diver descended by ladder or rope, stepping into darkness that swallowed every trace of the city above. His task was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to perform without fear. Recover lost items that had fallen into the open drains, or become lodged in the sludge that collected along the walls. Rings, coins, tools, and household objects were among the things people were willing to pay for, and the diver had no choice but to retrieve them. The tunnels were often filled to the knees, and sometimes to the chest, with a mixture of run-off animal remains and human waste. Moving through it required slow, deliberate steps. The water's surface hid sudden drops in the stone floor, or piles of refuse that shifted underfoot. Each step stirred the filth, releasing smells that clung tightly to the diver's clothes and skin. The air was stagnant, heavy with gases created by decay. Breathing too quickly could overwhelm a man, leaving him dizzy or unconscious within minutes. Many divers learned to take shallow breaths, spacing them carefully as they worked. It was a technique born from necessity, not training. Rats were constant companions in the tunnels, darting along narrow ledges or clinging to floating debris. They did not fear the divers. They had grown used to movement in the dark and often brushed against the workers' legs without hesitation. Some divers ignored them, understanding that reacting suddenly could throw off their balance. Others felt a persistent unease, knowing the rats were drawn to things that had already started to rot. There were carcasses of animals caught in the flow, swollen and pale, drifting in slow circles until the current carried them deeper. At times, the diver had to push them aside to continue searching. The divers carried tools strapped to their belts, hooks, small nets, and metal rods for probing the sludge. They worked with their hands when necessary, reaching into pockets of waste in hopes of finding the faint glint of metal. The water made every movement difficult. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the faint torchlight they carried. But the haze of moisture and rising gas often distorted shapes. They had to rely on touch more than sight, tracing the bottom of the tunnel with their fingers. Cuts and scrapes were unavoidable, and infections followed easily. Some men lost entire weeks to fever, while others developed chronic illnesses that worsened with each descent. The greatest danger came from the air itself. Pockets of toxic gas accumulated in low sections of the tunnel. These gases were invisible and unpredictable. A diver could be working steadily one moment and collapse the next. Those who survived such episodes were carried out by their companions, but many others were found only after their bodies floated to an outlet further downstream. The official cause of death was often listed simply as accident with little explanation. There was no structure of oversight, no detailed record keeping. The tunnels swallowed evidence along with the men who worked inside them. Flooding was another constant threat. Heavy rain could turn a narrow passage into a rapid channel, sweeping away anything in its path. A diver caught in such a surge had little chance of escape. The rising water trapped men against the stone ceiling, pushing them into corners where they could not breathe. Their bodies were often discovered days later, wedged between debris. Despite these dangers, the work continued, driven by the economic need created by a city that tossed objects into drains and then wanted them retrieved. The divers themselves occupied a strange position in society. They interacted with the public only long enough to receive payment or instructions. People avoided standing too close, unsettled by the damp smell that never fully left the divers' clothing. Yet the same people relied on them to recover valuables that would otherwise be lost forever. The divers knew they were necessary, but necessity did not translate into respect. Their work was hidden, performed in conditions that most citizens would refuse to imagine. Many divers entered the profession because no other options remained. Some had lost factory jobs, others had been injured in construction or mining. The tunnels offered steady pay even if the risks outweighed the rewards. They learned to navigate the passages by memory, noting where the stones dipped or where the current shifted. These details could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Over time, experienced divers developed a sense of the tunnel's moods, the subtle changes in air pressure or water level that signaled danger. But even experience could not protect them from every hazard. The city above changed rapidly during the Victorian era, expanding its factories and building new roads. Yet the tunnels remained largely the same old stone channels designed for a different time. As the population increased, the amount of waste flowing through them grew, turning the environment even more hazardous. Divers worked longer hours to meet demand, often descending into stretches of tunnel that had weakened with age. Collapse was always a possibility. Stones shifted, ceilings cracked, and debris fell without warning. Despite the grimness of the profession, divers rarely spoke of their fears. There was little use in admitting them. The work demanded a calm acceptance of danger. Panic could cost a man his life just as quickly as toxic air or rising water. Those who survived learned to move with a steady rhythm, tuning out the darkness, the rats, and the smell. They focused only on the task, recovering the objects that meant something to the people above, even if the divers themselves meant little in return. In the records of the time, sewer divers appear only occasionally, mentioned briefly in reports of accidents or in discussions of sanitation. The true extent of their labor was hidden beneath the city, in tunnels that bore the weight of human waste and neglect. Their work kept drains functioning and restored possessions that would otherwise have vanished forever. Yet their names, faces, and stories were absorbed into the filth they navigated, daily disappearing as quietly as they lived. Their world existed beneath the noise of the streets, built from shadows and stagnant air. The tasks they carried out revealed what society preferred to ignore. Somewhere deeper in the city's hidden channels, a threat waited that few would dare to look upon directly. In every old city, the polished image preserved in drawings and stories hides a reality that few choose to remember. The stone streets that tourists admire today once carried the weight of bodies' waste and the unseen labor that kept the population from collapsing under its own neglect. Behind the rows of houses built closely enough to trap smoke between them, there existed a layer of work that no respectable citizen wanted to acknowledge. This work fell to people who moved quietly through alleys before sunrise, men whose tasks involved carrying, cleaning, scraping, and disposing of what the city preferred to ignore. Their presence ensured that life above continued without interruption, even as their own lives unraveled in the shadows. The narrow lanes of crowded districts often concealed the worst of it. There were open drains, where runoff mixed with refuse from kitchens, workshops, and stables. Those who tended these passages did so because they had no other choice. They stepped into filth each morning to scrape away what had collected overnight, aware that if they did not, the drains would overflow and flood the homes of the poor. Above them, families cooked breakfast and swept dust from their floors, never realizing how many unseen hands had already passed beneath their windows. The labor was quiet, unnoticed, and unappreciated, yet the city depended on it more than it cared to admit. Bodies, too, were part of this hidden world. During outbreaks of disease, collectors moved through the streets before the sun rose high enough for others to notice. They carried stretchers stained from repeated use, lifting corpses from beds still warm with sickness. Families rarely spoke above a whisper during these removals. Shame, fear, or exhaustion made them step aside without protest. The collectors took the dead away in carts that rattled across uneven stones, disappearing toward burial pits outside the town. There were no ceremonies for these removals, no time for grief. The goal was containment, not comfort. The men who performed this work understood that their presence kept the city functioning, yet they received neither gratitude nor protection. Other workers found themselves dealing with different forms of decay. Some scraped refuse from butchers' stalls, pushing piles of bones, fat, and spoiled meat into carts that would later be burned or dumped. Others cleaned animal skins in sheds, where the smell of curing agents soaked into the walls. Each occupation carried its own hazards. Some men lived with rashes that never healed, others with damaged lungs that forced them to pause for breath after every few steps. The city's prosperity did not extend to them, though. It depended heavily on the results of their labor. No one admired the men who kept disease at bay or prevented sewage from rising. Respect belonged to those whose lives were far cleaner. The truth grew more unsettling when one considered how ordinary these conditions were. No one questioned why sewer scrapers or corpse carriers existed. They were simply part of the machinery of urban life. Their absence would have meant immediate disaster, but their presence was treated as an unfortunate necessity. People rarely learned their names, even if they passed them daily on the streets. These workers lived in rooms so small that the damp never left the walls, returning each morning to tasks that stripped away whatever dignity they tried to hold on to. Poverty pressed them into this labor, and once inside it, escape became nearly impossible. The city authorities acknowledged their work only when something went wrong. A drain overflowed, a disposal area caught fire, or a sickness spread through a crowded district. Officials appeared briefly inspecting the scene before assigning blame to the very people who had labored to prevent such disasters in the first place. Their wages did not increase, their conditions did not improve, and their training, if it could be called that, remained nothing more than repetition under the watchful eye of someone who simply wanted the job done. These men were instruments expected to endure everything from fumes to injuries without complaint. Despite their importance, they were kept at a distance by society. Clean streets and organized markets created the illusion of safety and order, but beneath that thin layer was a system built on people who handled disease, death, and waste daily. The contrast between appearance and reality was wide enough to swallow entire lives. Cleanliness became a performance, not a truth. It existed only because someone else out of sight dealt with everything that contradicted it. Understanding this part of history reveals how fragile the cities were. Without these unseen workers, sickness would have spread more rapidly, food markets would have become contaminated, and rivers would have overflowed with waste. Their labor ensured survival, yet they remained invisible. The city remembered its architecture, its leaders, its growth, but not the men who kept the ground beneath it from collapsing. Their stories rarely appear in records. Their names dissolved into the dirt they cleaned, and the tasks they performed became footnotes in broader discussions of urban life. But the reality persisted. Behind every well-kept street and public building stood a network of workers living in conditions far removed from the polished world above. Their lives show that history's clean surface was supported by a foundation far more unpleasant than most are willing to imagine. The streets admired today were once held together by hands that labored in filth. The order people trusted depended on those who lived beyond the edges of respect. Deep within that forgotten world, another duty emerged that revealed how much darker the past truly was. Public executions were events that drew crowds long before any formal announcement was made. Market stalls closed, early families gathered on rooftops, and vendors set up near the square, prepared to profit from morbid curiosity. Yet behind the spectacle, after the cheering and murmuring faded, the brutal work left behind did not simply disappear. It fell to a man whose name was rarely spoken aloud, someone who lived in the shadow of the executioner, the assistant. His duties began the moment the condemned man's body stopped moving and continued long after the crowd dispersed. While onlookers returned home satisfied or unsettled, he remained in the square preparing the dead for whatever fate awaited their remains. The assistant moved with a methodical familiarity, carrying tools that had been used many times before. His first task was to examine the body, wiping away blood that pooled in unexpected places or splashed across stone. The executioner performed the act itself, but he rarely stayed to witness the aftermath. The assistant knew to work quickly. Officials wanted the scene cleared so daily life could resume without lingering reminders of violence. He lifted limbs, brushed aside debris, and cut away clothing when necessary. The work was gritty, repetitive, and unwelcome by those who viewed him as an extension of death itself. Sometimes the head had been removed, whether by axe or device, and in those cases the assistant retrieved it carefully, knowing it would soon be placed on display. The city expected proof of justice, and severed heads mounted on iron spikes served as grim warnings. He cleaned the head as best he could, wiping away excess blood before carrying it up ladders or staircases to position it where the authorities instructed. The crowd rarely remained for this part. Only a few lingered, unable to look away, but they offered no words and refused to stand too close. He worked in near silence, aware that even in death the body retained a strange sort of presence. When burning was required, the assistant gathered wood, arranged it meticulously, and positioned the body so flames would spread evenly. The smell rose quickly, sharp and unmistakable, drifting through nearby streets. Some residents shut their windows, others pretended not to notice. Burning a body was meant to erase traces of the condemned, to prevent burial or memorial. The assistant remained until the fire died down, turning what remained with long tools to ensure nothing recognizable persisted. Once finished, he raked the ashes together, disposing of them in pits outside the city. His work was meant to remove every reminder of the condemned person's existence, yet it left marks on him that no fire could conceal. The psychological toll grew with each execution. Handling death so closely, so frequently altered the assistant's place in society. People avoided him in public, even when he purchased bread or passed through markets. Parents pulled their children aside or lowered their voices as he walked past. Some believed his presence brought misfortune. Others simply felt uneasy standing near someone who spent his hours touching, cleaning, and preparing the dead. He learned not to meet the eyes of strangers, recognizing the discomfort his appearance created. Even when wearing ordinary clothing, he was treated as if he carried the execution square with him wherever he went. Despite the discomfort he caused others, the assistant was necessary. Without him, the aftermath of executions would linger, disrupting daily routines and leaving public spaces stained with reminders of punishment. The government understood this and paid him accordingly, though not generously. His wages were higher than those of labourers, but lower than those of skilled tradesmen. The money compensated for the work, not the isolation that accompanied it. No one invited him to community gatherings, and few neighbours offered greetings. His profession overshadowed everything else, reducing his identity to the tasks he performed. He was often the first to arrive at a site and the last to leave. Before executions began, he inspected the equipment, testing ropes, sharpening blades, and ensuring everything functioned properly. Mistakes reflected poorly on the authorities, and he carried the burden of preventing them. After the executioner performed his role, the assistant managed the remaining logistics, lifting bodies, carrying tools, and restoring order. Even when he cleaned the stones thoroughly, faint stains reappeared after rain, as if the ground itself refused to forget what had happened. Still, he returned each time, repeating the ritual without complaint. Some assistants kept records of the condemned, writing details in small notebooks they hid from others. It was not sentimentality, but an attempt to preserve a sense of humanity in a world that treated both the executed and the assistant as disposable. These private writings rarely survived, destroyed when the assistant died or discarded by families who wished to forget the association. Yet the act of writing suggested a need to understand the work to impose meaning, where none was formally acknowledged. Executions were intended to demonstrate authority, but the assistant's involvement revealed another layer, the need to control what happened afterward. Justice, as the authorities defined it, extended beyond death. It required management display and cleanup. The assistant became the silent guardian of that process, ensuring the city remained visually orderly, even as it carried out acts of violence in public view. His existence was a reminder that punishment did not end with the final breath of the condemned. It continued in the way their remains were handled. Over time, the assistant aged quickly. His posture bent, his hands stiffened from years of gripping tools, and his eyes dulled from constant exposure to scenes others saw only once in their lifetime. The city did not acknowledge this wear. He simply continued until he could not. When illness or weakness forced him to stop, another man stepped into his place, inheriting both the duties and the stigma. The assistant's name faded, as quietly as the ashes he had stirred so many times. In studying this part of history, it becomes clear how deeply societies rely on those who manage the consequences of their systems. Executions may have reflected the law's authority, but the assistant bore the physical and emotional burden left behind. His presence ensured that public order returned quickly, even if his own life remained permanently marked by the work. The square regained its calm only because someone stayed behind to confront what others looked away from. Authority appeared orderly because someone had erased the parts that disturbed it. Beyond the edge of the scaffold's shadow, another task waited that demanded even greater endurance than the work left behind here. The work of tending to those afflicted with leprosy was rarely acknowledged in public, yet it continued daily in small outbuildings and isolated wards, where the sick were kept apart from the rest of society. The washer's task began before most people left their beds. He stepped into rooms that carried the faint, persistent smell of illness, mixed with damp cloth and the slow decay of skin that had lost its ability to heal. The washer was responsible for bathing the patients, cleaning their sores, and tending to whatever needs their weakened bodies could no longer manage. It was a profession shaped not by training, but by desperation, drawing those who had little else available to them. The washer moved methodically through the ward, carrying basins of water that cooled too quickly in the drafty halls. The patients often sat quietly, wrapped in coarse blankets, waiting for assistance. Many had lost sensation in their limbs, and their injuries went unnoticed until infection had already spread. The washer understood this and handled their bodies with care, gently lifting arms and legs that had grown thin or stiff. He washed their faces, wiped away dried blood, and applied simple salves intended to ease discomfort. The process was slow, repetitive, and unchanging, yet it demanded patience from someone whose own life offered little comfort in return. Society viewed leprosy with deep suspicion, treating it as both a medical condition and a moral failing. Many believed the disease reflected impurity or divine punishment, and this belief shaped the way communities reacted toward the afflicted. Families distanced themselves, neighbors whispered, and officials moved the sick to the outskirts of towns. The washer became one of the few people who interacted with them directly. His poverty granted him no privilege, but it allowed him to accept work others refused. Illiteracy was common among washers not because the job required ignorance, but because those with education had more choices and avoided the risks that came with caring for the diseased. The washer's hands showed signs of his labor. Cracks formed along the skin from constant washing, and small cuts often turned into sores that took weeks to heal. Each wound carried the fear of infection. While not every exposure led to sickness, the possibility hovered over him each time he touched a patient. He understood the danger, but continued knowing that the job provided the coins he needed for food and shelter. In a society with strict class divisions, his role placed him on one of the lowest tiers, yet he performed tasks that few dared to consider. Between washings, the washer changed bedding, cleaned floors, and removed containers of waste. The ward lacked proper ventilation, and illnesses lingered in the air. Windows opened rarely, especially during colder seasons, leaving the air stagnant and heavy. Some patients coughed throughout the night, their voices weakened by years of isolation. Others sat in silence, resigned to routines that no longer surprised them. The washer saw every stage of decline. He recognized when a patient's movements grew slow, when their appetite faded, or when their strength diminished after a night of fever. He recorded none of this formally. He simply adjusted his care as needed. Isolation shaped every part of the work. The washer seldom had visitors or interactions outside the ward. People avoided him in the streets, stepping around him as if disease clung to his clothes. Shopkeepers hesitated before handing him goods, and landlords questioned his ability to pay rent. Even when he took precautions, washing thoroughly, wearing layers that he changed daily, the stigma followed him. The disease had marked the patients physically, but it marked the washer socially, making his presence uncomfortable for those who preferred to pretend leprosy did not exist. Despite the conditions, there were moments of routine that brought a sense of order to the washer's days. He boiled linens in large kettles, scrubbed basins until they gleamed faintly in the dim light, and prepared simple meals for those too weak to eat unaided. The repetition dulled, the fear shaping each day into predictable steps. Yet the job carried emotional weight that lingered long after he closed the ward's doors. He watched patients lose parts of themselves slowly. Fingers, toes, patches of skin that no longer healed. Their faces changed over time, features softening or collapsing as the disease progressed. The washer witnessed these transformations with a kind of detached compassion, knowing he could not stop them. Death was not sudden in the ward. It came gradually, often after months of weakening. The washer noticed when a patient became too tired to speak, or when their breath shifted into irregular patterns. He cleaned their bodies one final time, closing their eyes and covering them with cloth until someone arrived to remove them. There were no funerals or public mourning. The patients were buried without ceremony, and the ward returned to silence. The washer resumed his duties, aware that another person would soon occupy the bed that had just been emptied. The washer's own health deteriorated over time. Constant exposure to illness weakened his immune system, and bouts of fever became more frequent. His joints stiffened from lifting patients, and his eyesight suffered in the poorly lit rooms. Yet there were always more tasks to complete, more bodies to tend to, more beds to prepare. The work did not stop, and neither did the city's need to isolate those it feared. Understanding the washer's role reveals much about Victorian values. The era celebrated progress and moral refinement, yet maintained institutions where the poorest cared for the most vulnerable without support or recognition. The washer acted as a quiet barrier between society and the afflicted, absorbing the risks so others could maintain the illusion of safety. His contributions were invisible, overshadowed by fear and prejudice. His position existed not because the city wished to provide care, but because the sick could not be ignored entirely. The washer lived and worked in a world where compassion was expected, but rarely rewarded. His proximity to suffering made him essential, even as it pushed him further from acceptance within the community. His story, like those of many who handled the most difficult tasks of the era, remained unrecorded, slipping into the background of a society that preferred to look elsewhere. The ward stayed orderly only because someone moved through its silence each morning. The city remained confident in its boundaries, because someone tended to those pushed beyond them. Deeper within the world of forgotten labor, another duty emerged that carried dangers no less consuming than these halls of sickness. The presence of the tooth puller was impossible to ignore in the crowded market squares of Victorian towns. He stood near the busiest stalls carrying a small wooden box filled with crude metal tools that clinked together whenever he moved. His services required no formal training, no certification, and no knowledge of anatomy beyond the assumption that teeth could be removed if pulled hard enough. People came to him because they had no alternative. Dentists were rare and expensive. Pain was constant and unbearable. The tooth puller offered a solution quick and cheap, even if it left more damage than relief. He chose locations where customers naturally gathered, setting up near fishmongers, cloth sellers, or butchers. His presence blended into the noise and movement of daily commerce. When someone approached with swollen cheeks or throbbing gums, the tooth puller reached into his box and pulled out one of his tools. Rusted pliers, hooked instruments, or metal clamps worn smooth from years of use. He cleaned none of them. The tools carried dried blood and fragments of bone from previous customers, remnants of the pain already experienced by countless others. Yet no one questioned the tool's condition. Pain overwhelmed caution. The procedure took place in full view of the market. The customer sat on a stool or crate, gripping its edges, while the tooth puller positioned his instrument around the decayed tooth. There was no anesthesia, no attempt to numb the area. The tooth puller simply tightened his grip and pulled with sudden force. Sometimes the tooth came out quickly, but often it broke, splintering into jagged pieces that had to be extracted one by one. Blood ran down the customer's chin, dripping onto the ground or onto the cloths the tooth puller kept for repeated use. People walking by turned their heads briefly, but few stopped to watch. pain was a common sight. The lack of sanitation guaranteed infection. Many customers returned home with open wounds that swelled over the following days. Some developed fevers or abscesses that spread into their jawbones. Without proper medical care, the infection could become life-threatening. Yet the tooth puller continued working, moving from town to town or from market to market. When illness or death followed his procedures, people rarely made the connection. They blamed poor health, bad luck, or the unavoidable risks of living in a crowded city. The tooth puller remained untouched by blame, even though his hands were stained with traces of every extraction. His mobility made it difficult for authorities to regulate. Some towns attempted to impose rules, but the tooth puller simply traveled to areas where enforcement was weaker. He relied on word of mouth to find new customers, positioning himself in places where poverty and desperation made people more willing to accept risky solutions. The din of the marketplace masked the cries of those he treated, making his presence tolerable even for those who preferred not to think about the pain unfolding only steps away. His work thrived in environments where suffering blended into the rhythm of daily life. The tooth puller carried the evidence of his profession with him. Dried blood accumulated under his nails, stains marked his sleeves, and the smell of old iron lingered in his clothing. Some people avoided standing too close, unsettled by the mixture of sweat, metal, and decay that surrounded him. Others approached without hesitation, driven by discomfort that overshadowed revulsion. The tooth puller offered immediate relief, even if it was incomplete or temporary. Customers climbed onto his stool knowing the experience would be brutal. Their willingness reflected the absence of better options. He charged low prices because the market demanded it. Wealthier citizens sought trained professionals who operated in cleaner environments, but the poor had only him. The tooth puller accepted coins, food, or whatever a customer could offer. His income fluctuated with the needs of the community. On some days, he treated dozens of people. On others, he waited for hours without a single request. He endured the irregularity because he had no other trade. Removing teeth was his livelihood, shaped by necessity rather than choice. The tooth puller's methods created a cycle he did not fully acknowledge. He relieved immediate pain while often causing future illness. The infections that followed his procedures sometimes produced further decay, leading customers to return to him once more. Those who recovered repeated the tooth puller's name in conversations, ensuring a steady flow of new customers. His presence was both a solution and a problem, embedded deeply in the structure of poor districts where health was fragile and medical care scarce. Despite the brutality of his work, the tooth puller seldom reflected on the damage left behind. His focus remained on volume, how many extractions he could perform before the day ended. He cleaned his tools by wiping them with cloths darkened from use, then dropped them back into the box to await the next customer. The market's movement continued around him, masking the severity of his actions. To the tooth puller, the cries of pain were simply part of the trade, not something to reconsider or examine. He aged quickly. Years of bending over, patience gripping tools with force, and inhaling the odors of infection left him with stiff joints and weakened lungs. His eyesight dimmed, making it difficult to locate the exact angle needed for extraction. Yet he continued working, guided more by habit than precision. As his strength faded, his methods became rougher, producing louder cries from customers who sensed the decline but tolerated it because they had no alternative. The tooth puller's story illustrates a broader truth about Victorian life necessity, often masked danger. People endured procedures that risked their health because suffering left them little choice. The tooth puller existed not because society endorsed him, but because society failed to provide safer options for those most in need. His presence marked the gap between the ideal of medical progress and the reality of poverty. The market lived with its noise only because pain found its outlet there. The illusion of quick relief persisted because desperation overshadowed caution. Farther within the world of makeshift medicine, another profession rose from the same hunger for survival. Working as a midwife for noble households meant stepping into a world where every decision carried consequences far greater than the act of childbirth itself. She entered grand residences through side entrances, moving quietly along narrow passages watched by servants who regarded her with a mixture of hope and suspicion. Her arrival marked the shift from ordinary routine to tense anticipation. Within those rooms, a noble lineage waited for either continuation or collapse, and she alone stood responsible for guiding the process from the first cries of labor to the uncertain final moments. Inside the birthing chamber, the midwife arranged her simple instruments, small knives, coarse thread, bundles of cloth, heated in shallow basins. Nothing displayed refinement. Every tool reflected necessity more than comfort. Birth among the nobility carried the same physical danger faced in poorer homes, yet the stakes reached into politics, inheritance, and reputation. Success earned no praise. Failure threatened her entire existence. Each decision required precision, though she was granted no margin for misjudgment. Labor often stretched across hours, testing the endurance of everyone present. The midwife supported the mother's weight, cleaned blood between contractions, and adjusted the infant's position when needed. Her role demanded steady concentration. If the child struggled to descend, she intervened with cuts, pressure, or stitching that left her hands trembling long after the task was complete. The cries that filled the chamber did not distract her. They were familiar markers of a process she had repeated countless times. Yet repetition offered no comfort. She had seen outcomes in which both mother and child left the room silently, and that memory followed her through every birth. When complications appeared, danger expanded swiftly. A single moment of misfortune could reshape her future. If the infant died, or the mother weakened beyond recovery, rumors spread through the household almost immediately. Servants whispered. Relatives demanded explanations. A noble family mourning an heir looked for a target to absorb its grief and anger, and the midwife's presence made her the nearest choice. Suspicion deepened as attention turned to the herbs she carried, the gestures she used, and the whispered instructions she offered. Fear fed interpretation. Accusations grew from superstition. Many believed that childbirth connected earthly life with forces beyond human understanding. If misfortune struck, someone must have invited it. A midwife, familiar with the fragile boundary between life and death, became an easy vessel for blame. Her knowledge of medicinal plants once valued appeared threatening. Her experience with difficult births looked like evidence of something forbidden. Before long, her name could be tied to claims of witchcraft, leading to interrogation, confinement, or the threat of fire. Even successful births did little to secure her position. Families celebrated the arrival of an heir, yet they rarely acknowledged the midwife's effort. Servants watched her movements closely, analyzing every gesture. Any hesitation could be interpreted as an omen. She left each residence quietly aware that goodwill lasted only until the next complication. Her relationships were fragile, dependent not on skill, but on circumstances beyond her control. Life outside noble homes offered its own difficulties. She lived among common people, yet remained apart from them. Neighbors respected her ability to assist in childbirth, but many kept their distance, uneasy with the blood and grief associated with her profession. She existed in a narrow space between belonging and suspicion, valued for her expertise yet avoided for the same reason. Her days were filled with labor, but not with companionship. Her training came through practice rather than formal study. Older midwives taught her the techniques needed to guide a birth, how to reposition a child, how to slow bleeding, how to ease obstructed labor. These teachings passed quietly, from one woman to another, never recorded in books or recognized by official authorities. The knowledge held great value, yet society granted no protection to those who carried it. In the eyes of many, understanding the workings of the body too well resembled interfering with forces that should remain untouched. Within noble birthing rooms, she moved across floors, scattered with damp cloth, checking the mother's pulse, adjusting her position, and preparing for the final moments when the infant emerged. Candlelight flickered against the walls, casting shadows that shifted with each movement. She lifted the newborn with practiced steadiness, assessing its breathing and color before presenting it to the family. Relief spread through the room, but gratitude rarely followed. She gathered her tools, cleaned what she could, and departed with the same quiet presence with which she had arrived. Even after leaving, fear lingered. Households remembered her only when misfortune occurred. She lived with the constant awareness that a single birth gone wrong could undo years of service. Her profession demanded strength, yet offered no security. She walked through markets or village paths, carrying burdens unseen by those who passed her without acknowledgement. Each day she prepared to face another birth, aware that success provided merely a temporary shield against suspicion. Understanding her position exposes the tension between necessity and fear in medieval society. Noble families depended on her skill to ensure the continuation of their bloodlines, yet remained ready to abandon her at the first sign of trouble. Her work supported the structure of inheritance and authority, even while her livelihood remained fragile. She carried responsibility without respect and bore risks without protection. Her quiet labor held noble households together, yet her existence remained exposed to dangers no one wished to acknowledge. Another world of work waited where the margin for error narrowed even further, and every misstep carried a deeper cost. There, a single failure could decide the fate of an entire family before anyone realized the risk unfolding. Among the many forms of labor that shaped medieval life, a small group of tasks existed in which a single mistake not only determined the outcome of the job, but also the future of entire households. These were positions carried by individuals who rarely appeared in written records and were never celebrated for their involvement. Their responsibilities were heavy, yet their names remained unspoken. In crowded towns or isolated villages, people relied on their skills without ever acknowledging the risks that lay behind them. A mistake made by one of these workers often unfolded quietly, before anyone realized a crisis had begun. And by the time the consequences became visible, the damage had already touched every corner of a family's existence. Those who performed such roles worked under constant pressure. Each action required careful attention, and every routine task demanded perfect execution. They lived in a world where failure was not measured by lost profit or damaged reputation, but by the immediate suffering of others. A misjudged movement could interrupt a life that had only just begun. A momentary lapse could break the fragile structure that held a household together. Yet the workers who carried this burden rarely possessed the protection or support that might have matched the seriousness of their duties. They were often poor, poorly housed, and poorly fed, maintaining their roles because they had no alternative. The work placed them in situations that exposed the limits of the human body. They often operated at night, in cramped rooms, or in conditions shaped by illness, fear, or instability. Their hands shook with exhaustion, but the task still required precision. Their breathing grew heavy, but they could not stop. They learned to silence their own anxieties because hesitation might invite disaster. These workers existed in a constant state of tension, balancing the expectations of families who depended on them, with the reality that circumstances could turn against them at any moment. When tragedy occurred, blame rarely followed any logical path. Families struck by loss looked for reasons, and these workers offered a convenient answer. The community whispered not because it understood the situation, but because it needed a story that could be shared. Misfortune became a kind of narrative shaped by fear, rumor, and superstition. The worker involved found themselves isolated almost instantly. Neighbors avoided them. Employers distanced themselves. Officials questioned them. In some cases, the accusations grew so severe that survival itself became uncertain. Punishments varied: imprisonment, humiliation, or worse, because people believed that a person who could not prevent tragedy must somehow be responsible for inviting it. Even when no disaster occurred, the same workers lived under the constant shadow of potential failure. They woke each morning knowing the day might bring a situation where every movement mattered. They carried the memories of past incidents, including those where outcomes slipped beyond their reach, despite their best efforts. Their profession demanded calm, yet offered no space for recovery from the emotional weight of their experiences. The lack of recognition deepened the burden. They completed tasks quietly and left without acknowledgement. Their contribution existed only in the absence of catastrophe, and few noticed their presence until something went wrong. The communities surrounding them did little to lessen this pressure. Medieval societies placed immense value on stability, lineage, and the appearance of order. Any disruption in these expectations required explanation. Instead of investigating the complex realities behind each event, people turned to the simplest answer available. Workers in high-risk roles became symbols of fragility rather than skill. They stood at the intersection of necessity and fear, needed for their abilities, yet distrusted for the proximity they held to death, illness, or misfortune. Their survival depended not only on competence, but on circumstances they could not control. Their lives followed patterns, shaped by both routine and uncertainty. They moved through familiar structures, homes, workshops, and chambers, yet each environment carried unpredictable threats. They learned to anticipate the shifts in mood among the people they served, the tension in a room before an event unfolded, the signs that circumstances were slipping away from them. These observations helped them work, but they did not protect them from the consequences of unfortunate outcomes. Their knowledge remained unrecognized, overshadowed by the fear that surrounded their profession. Troubling stories followed them wherever they went. People recited incidents from previous towns or past generations, expanding each tale with new details until it resembled myth more than memory. These workers lived under the weight of collective superstition. Their presence inspired caution. Their actions sparked suspicion, and their role in society hovered between service and condemnation. Their anonymity was a shield only until something went wrong. After that, their lives changed abruptly, and their futures narrowed into paths marked by fear or punishment. Understanding their position reveals the contradictions at the heart of medieval life. Communities depended on these individuals for survival, yet refused to grant them respect or security. Their responsibilities shaped the well-being of families, yet their failures, whether real or perceived, became evidence of personal fault rather than circumstance. They worked with dedication, yet lived with the knowledge that any misstep could transform them from necessary servant to condemned outsider. Their influence reached every household even when their names remained unsaid. Their burden deepened because success left no trace, while failure reshaped entire lives. Beyond this fragile boundary of duty, another figure stepped forward to carry a different kind of weight during encounters with the dead. Sign-eaters existed on the outer edge of medieval life, moving quietly between villages where death appeared more frequently than most people wished to admit. Their role was rarely discussed openly, yet nearly every community knew how to summon one when a family feared the spiritual fate of a dying relative. The sign-eater arrived when the household had grown silent, usually after the final breath had been taken, and the body had been arranged on a wooden board or narrow bed. His task was simple in appearance, but heavy in meaning. He consumed a piece of bread and drank ale placed on the chest of the deceased, performing a ritual believed to draw the dead person's sins into his own body. To the family, this act offered comfort and reassurance that their loved one would find rest beyond the grave. To the sign-eater, it meant carrying yet another burden he could never escape. He entered homes without being welcomed. People stepped aside as he passed, avoiding his gaze as though acknowledging him too directly might invite misfortune. The air inside the room carried the familiar blend of smoke, candle wax, and the quiet stillness that followed death. Bread rested on the body, untouched until he approached. The family watched from a distance, their silence shaped not by reverence for the ritual, but by unease toward the man performing it. He reached for the bread with steady hands, ate it slowly, and drank the ale as required. The act lasted only moments, yet its consequences followed him far beyond the household. Once the ritual was complete, the family offered him a small payment, coins, food, or scraps of clothing. The sign-eater never refused, because refusal meant losing the only livelihood available to him. People avoided hiring him for any task unrelated to death. Children whispered about him near doorways, and adults turned their backs when he approached public spaces. The sign-eater accepted these reactions without protest. He lived with the understanding that his presence reminded others of the darkness they preferred to keep hidden. In villages that depended on superstition for stability, someone had to absorb the anxieties that surrounded death, and the sign-eater became that vessel. He walked alone through fields and narrow lanes, settling in abandoned shacks or small huts at the outskirts of each settlement. His isolation grew deeper with each ritual. People viewed him as spiritually contaminated, a man who carried the accumulated sins of dozens of souls. The simple act of sharing a meal with him was unthinkable, and allowing him inside a public building was considered dangerous. Churches barred their doors to him. Priests refused to speak with him. Even burying him in consecrated ground would have been considered a violation. The sign-eater lived as a necessary outcast, needed only when death arrived, but avoided at all other times. The ritual shaped his daily routine. He woke at uncertain hours depending on when the next message reached him. Messengers rarely approached directly. They left a sign, a small stone, a bundle of straw, a marked stick near the path he walked most often. This sign meant death had occurred, and his presence was required. The sign-eater followed these signals without question, entering each home quietly and leaving with even less acknowledgement. His footsteps blended into the rhythms of village life, heard only when fear made them unavoidable. Each ritual added weight to his reputation. Stories grew around him, shaped more by imagination than truth. People believed his eyes carried the shadows of the dead, that his breath chilled the air, that he could sense approaching misfortune. These ideas spread because they satisfied a collective need to explain the unknown. The sign-eater himself did nothing to reinforce or dispel such beliefs. He simply continued his work, knowing that refusing it meant starvation, and accepting it meant lifelong exile. His body bore signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. He ate irregularly, relying on small offerings from grieving families. His clothes were worn, his movements slow. Yet when performing the ritual, he maintained a calm steadiness. He understood that the family needed to see the act completed without hesitation. In a world where illness spread quickly and death came suddenly, rituals offered structure. The Sign Eater became part of that structure, even as people worked to keep him outside the boundaries of ordinary life. When he walked back to his hut after a ritual, the paths felt quieter than before. Birds fell silent near him, though perhaps only because his footsteps disrupted their routine. In the villages, he served people closed shutters as he passed. Some crossed themselves. Children hid behind fences. His existence reminded them of the fragility of life and the uncertainty that followed it. The Sign Eater did not resent their reactions. Resentment required a closeness he no longer felt toward other people. Despite their discomfort, communities preserved the ritual because it gave them comfort during loss. Families believed that transferring sins to another person ensured a peaceful transition for the dead. The Sign Eater's presence allowed them to sleep at night, certain that a dangerous spiritual burden no longer lingered in their homes. Their relief came at the cost of his isolation, a trade they accepted without apology. The Sign Eater understood this. His role existed not out of respect but out of fear, and fear rarely offered gratitude. Understanding his life reveals the contradictions of medieval belief. Communities rejected him publicly while relying on him privately. They feared contamination, yet allowed him to perform a ritual involving intimate contact with the dead. They admired spiritual purity, yet handed their darkest concerns to a man they treated as a ghost long before he died. His existence defined the space between necessity and denial, a space every society creates when confronted with the weight of death. His path remained invisible until grief forced families to search for him. His presence shaped the moment between death and burial because others refused to face it themselves. Beyond this boundary of unspoken ritual, another figure labored in darkness to build structures that turned fear into a permanent display. Gibbet builders worked on the edge of medieval settlements, choosing locations where open fields or crossroads met the direction of incoming travelers. Their role centered on constructing the tall wooden frames and iron cages used to display the bodies of executed criminals. The structures served as warnings to anyone approaching the town, reminders of the consequences awaiting those who challenged authority. Though simple in appearance, each gibbet required careful planning and precise assembly. The builder worked with heavy beams, hammered iron rings into place, and shaped the cage so it could hold a decomposing body for months at a time. His labor ensured that the display remained visible long after the execution had ended. Most communities considered the gibbet builder necessary, but deeply unsettling. People avoided speaking to him unless his skills were needed. He purchased his materials, quietly loading carts with wood and metal before disappearing from view. Once summoned, he worked alone, often in silence, measuring the height of the post and securing it firmly into the ground. Strength mattered, but so did endurance. The structures had to withstand storms, winds, and the long process of decay. Few acknowledged the difficulty of this task. The town simply expected the warning to stand without interruption. The builder's responsibilities extended beyond construction. When a body had hung long enough for bones to loosen and limbs to slip through the bars, someone had to manage the remains. This task also fell to him. He approached the gibbet at dawn or late at night, avoiding crowds that gathered during the day. The air around the structure carried the thick smell of decomposition mixed with rusted iron and damp soil. Birds circled overhead, and insects moved in clusters across the cage. The builder removed what remained of the body, collecting fragments with gloved hands, though the gloves offered little protection from the lingering stench that clung to him for days. Handling decomposed remains required a familiarity with decay that few people could tolerate. Flesh often fell away from bone as he worked, and clothing disintegrated at the lightest touch. He carried the remains to burial sites designated for criminals, far from consecrated ground. No ceremony marked the burial. Once the ground was covered, he returned to the gibbet to prepare it for the next occupant. These tasks shaped his daily routine. The builder moved between construction, maintenance, and disposal, repeating the cycle without complaint. Survival depended on accepting tasks others refused. Communities preferred that he work at night. People did not want to see the process behind the structures that loomed over their roads. Night work allowed him to remain unseen, reducing the discomfort his presence caused. He carried lanterns with shields to limit visibility, setting them on the ground while he hammered iron into place. The dim glow revealed only fragments of his figure, gloved hands, worn boots, and the edges of tools resting near his feet. The quiet rhythm of his work blended with distant sounds of wind or animals moving through the dark. Despite avoiding confrontation, he frequently heard comments whispered from a distance. Some people considered him an omen. Others believed misfortune followed those who touched the bodies of criminals. A few thought his work aligned him with the darkness, represented by the gibbet itself. These feelings shaped his isolation. Shopkeepers hesitated when dealing with him. Neighbors avoided crossing paths. Even workers engaged in other difficult trades kept their distance. He accepted the separation without seeking connection, knowing his livelihood depended on inhabiting the margins of society. The gibbet builder's daily labor reflected both physical strain and emotional endurance. He carried beams heavier than most men could lift alone. He shaped iron that resisted every blow. He climbed ladders haunted by the smell of bodies that had hung there before. His clothing absorbed the odors of decay, making it impossible to remove the scent completely. He cleaned himself thoroughly after each task, yet traces remained embedded in his skin. Sleep came slowly on such nights, interrupted by memories of sounds or sights he had grown accustomed to. Power structures of the era relied on the presence of the gibbet. Authorities understood that public executions alone did not create lasting fear. The continued display of the executed reinforced obedience far more effectively. The builder's work ensured that punishment extended beyond the moment of death. Those traveling past the gibbet witnessed the consequences of defying the law in a way no proclamation could match. The builder shaped that message, even if the community refused to acknowledge his contribution. His life remained defined by routine and solitude. He ate simple meals, repaired his tools, and walked the outskirts of towns. He rarely spoke to others, and when he did, interactions were brief. His presence served a purpose that no one wished to confront directly. Understanding him required acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that societies often depend on unseen labor to maintain order. His role existed not because people respected it, but because they feared what might happen without it. Gibbets continued to rise across fields, their silhouettes stretching across the horizon. Travelers slowed as they approached them. Locals stepped farther from the path. The builder watched these reactions, quietly aware that his work achieved exactly what the authorities intended. Yet he also recognized that every structure he built contributed to the isolation that shaped his life. He carried out his duties with precision, even as the weight of each task settled deeper into his body. The warnings that greeted every traveler endured only because one man shaped them in silence. The order towns relied upon appeared stable because he maintained the structures others preferred not to see. From within the same harsh world of unspoken labor, another role surfaced where control demanded pain rather than iron cages. Animal castrators lived on the outskirts of medieval communities, where barns, fields, and livestock pens created an uneasy border between daily life and the tasks others refused to confront. Their work focused on controlling the temperaments of horses, cattle, and other animals by removing the source of aggression. The process required strength, speed, and an acceptance of bloodshed that shaped every hour of their existence. They traveled between farms carrying a bundle of tools wrapped in cloth, iron knives, clamps, and strips of leather objects that revealed their profession long before they spoke a word. The presence of these tools alone created distance between them and the people who relied on them. When a farm summoned the castrator, the atmosphere shifted. Animals sensed the tension before the procedure began, stamping the ground or pulling against ropes as if aware of what awaited them. The castrator worked with practiced efficiency, heating his blade over a fire until it glowed a faint red. The scent of burning metal carried across the yard, mixing with dust, manure, and the sharp odor of fear rising from the animals. Farmers watched from a distance, unwilling to stand too close. Their dependence on the castrator did not lessen their discomfort. The task demanded a level of brutality that most preferred not to witness directly. The castration itself unfolded quickly but violently. The castrator restrained the animal with ropes or relied on assistants to hold it steady. His movements had to be precise. A slip of the blade endangered both the castrator and anyone nearby. Once he cut the hot iron blade cauterized the wound, releasing a burst of smell that clung to the air long after the procedure ended. The animal collapsed or kicked, struggling against both the pain and the loss of strength. The castrator stepped back only when he was certain the bleeding had slowed. His hands remained steady even as sweat dripped along his arms. Injuries were unavoidable. The castrator often left farms with bruises along his ribs, cuts on his arms, or strains that lingered for days. Horses kicked with the force of panic. Bulls charged without warning. Even smaller animals reacted unpredictably once pain overwhelmed instinct. The castrator accepted these risks without complaint. His livelihood required confronting the aggression of animals at their strongest. He learned to anticipate movement, to judge distance, and to keep a calm posture even while danger unfolded only inches away. Still, no amount of experience protected him from every accident. Many castrators carried permanent injuries, limps, stiff joints, or scars that traced the outlines of past encounters. The constant exposure to blood defined his identity within the community. No amount of washing could remove the smell entirely. It settled into the fibers of his clothing, into the creases of his hands, and into the leather straps that held his tools. People noticed the scent before they noticed his face. They stepped aside when he walked through markets uncomfortable with the reminder of violence that followed him. Even those who hired him avoided casual conversation, offering payment quickly before retreating indoors. The castrator understood this reaction. His work kept order among livestock, but it also placed him far outside the boundaries of social comfort. Isolation shaped his routines. He ate alone, slept in small huts near fields, and spent evenings repairing his tools beside dim lanterns. He rarely interacted with families except during work. Children whispered about him, repeating stories of the animals he had subdued. Adults treated him with formal politeness that concealed a deeper reluctance. He was needed yet separated. His presence carried the same tension that surrounded other professions linked to pain or death. People acknowledged the necessity of the castrator, but they preferred that his involvement end as soon as possible. The emotional weight of the work accumulated slowly. The castrator grew accustomed to the sounds animals made during the procedure. The sudden cries, the heavy breathing, the frantic movements. These sounds repeated in his memory long after he packed his tools. He did not dwell on them, yet they shaped his understanding of the world. Pain was a constant element, something he confronted daily. Where others saw livestock as symbols of livelihood, he saw vulnerable bodies responding to fear. His task required suppressing empathy to ensure precision, yet the strain of this suppression stayed with him. Farmers often judged the castrator solely by results. A successfully subdued animal brought relief, while complications fueled frustration or blame. The castrator bore responsibility for outcomes he could not fully control. Infection might set in despite his efforts. Healing could stall. An injured animal might become unstable. These situations placed him in difficult positions, yet he accepted them as part of the profession. There was no system of support, no structure to defend him when accusations arose. Each job existed on its own, judged only by immediate results. His contribution to medieval society was both practical and overlooked. Castration allowed farmers to manage livestock, prevent injuries, and maintain stable herds. It shaped trade, transportation, and agriculture. Yet few acknowledged that this stability depended on one man's willingness to engage directly with pain and risk. His work existed in silence, overshadowed by discomfort. Communities valued the results, but dismissed the worker. The castrator remained a figure defined by necessity rather than recognition. Understanding his life reveals a wider truth about the era. Medieval society relied on individuals who performed difficult, unpleasant tasks to sustain its structure. Yet these individuals lived with isolation, danger, and stigma. The castrator embodied this contradiction. He moved through open fields and farmyards, performing a service that shaped daily life, but left no place for him within the community he supported. The herd stayed manageable only because someone faced their violence without hesitation. The order of each farm held firm because one man accepted risks that others stepped away from. Within the same harsh landscape of labor, another role surfaced where control depended on striking human flesh instead of restraining animals. Prison whippers operated in the narrow corridors and dim courtyards of medieval correctional spaces, where punishment replaced justice and discipline was delivered through repeated blows rather than structured judgment. They were summoned whenever an offender, whether a hardened criminal, a poor laborer, unable to pay fines, or a child who had broken minor rules, was deemed in need of physical correction. Their work demanded neither legal training nor understanding of guilt. It required only a willingness to strike another human being, until the appointed number of lashes had been met. The role persisted because societies viewed pain as a method of control, and the whipper became the tool that made such control visible. The whipper rarely acted under direct supervision. Guards issued brief instructions, then stepped aside. Once the prisoner was tied to a post or pushed to the ground, the whipper approached with a leather scourge or bundle of cords hardened with knots. His movements were steady, shaped by routine rather than emotion. He did not look at the prisoner's face. One of the unspoken expectations of his profession was to avoid any eye contact that might introduce doubt or hesitation. Maintaining distance allowed him to continue his work without interruption. The sound of each strike echoed in the confined spaces, filling the air with a painful rhythm, recognized by everyone who lived or worked within the prison walls. Payment came irregularly. Some days he received a few scraps of food, bread, salted meat, or leftover stew. Other days he accepted small amounts of cheap alcohol, meant to dull the strain that accumulated in his body and mind. Unlike guards or officials, he held no position of authority. His value depended solely on his ability to deliver pain efficiently. People avoided interaction with him outside the prison, uncomfortable with the knowledge that he spent his days inflicting suffering. Yet when someone needed punishment administered quickly, he became indispensable. The routine shaped him physically. Repeated motions strengthened some muscles while leaving others stiff and aching. His shoulders carried the tension of countless lashes. His wrists grew calloused from gripping the handle of the whip. He moved with a controlled precision that came from long practice, yet each task added subtle wear to his body. Bruises developed along his arms from prisoners who kicked or twisted in protest. Dust, sweat, and the smell of confinement clung to him long after he left the prison grounds. Children were not exempt from his duties. Young offenders, often impoverished and without guidance, were dragged into the courtyard for correction. Their cries echoed differently from those of adults, yet the whipper's task remained unchanged. He struck, according to the orders given, keeping his gaze lowered, so that the moment remained strictly procedural. The prison relied on this separation. Any hint of mercy could undermine the purpose of the punishment. The whipper learned to silence his reactions, reducing each task to a series of calculated movements. Isolation followed him into every part of his life. In markets, people stepped aside as he passed. Families lowered their voices, unwilling to draw attention. Even taverns, which accepted nearly everyone who could pay, treated him with caution. The combination of his work and the lingering smell of leather sweat and enclosed spaces made others uneasy. He occupied a social position similar to those who handled death or disease necessary yet avoided. Those who witnessed his work did not see the human being behind the whip. They saw the instrument of punishment. Despite the emotional burden, the whipper understood the stability his work provided to the system around him. Authorities depended on visible punishment to maintain order. A lashing delivered in public or within earshot of other prisoners reinforced the consequences of disobedience. The whipper became the physical embodiment of the rules that governed the prison, and his presence ensured those rules carried weight. Without him, officials feared that discipline would crumble. The whipper accepted this reality without expecting gratitude or recognition. There were moments when the weight of his work became more visible. On cold mornings, when frost covered the prison walls, the handle of the whip chilled his hands before he began. On hot afternoons, the air thickened with odors that heightened the claustrophobia of the space. He performed his task regardless of conditions. The prison did not alter schedules for weather or exhaustion. Discipline had to be maintained, and he served as the vehicle through which it was delivered. The emotional toll accumulated quietly. Nights offered little rest. The sounds of impact, the gasps of prisoners, and the heavy silence that followed each session replayed in his memory. He rarely spoke of these experiences, knowing no one wished to hear them. The community preferred to view him as emotionless, believing that only someone without feeling could continue such a role. In reality, he learned to suppress reflection because reflection threatened his ability to function. The profession allowed no space for hesitation. Understanding the prison whipper reveals another layer of medieval life, where violence operated as a structured routine rather than a chaotic force. His existence shows how societies maintained order through individuals who performed acts others refused to acknowledge. He became both a symbol and a shield, absorbing the responsibility for punishment so that the system around him could present itself as orderly, controlled, and necessary. They carried out punishment as if it were a normal chore, where no court existed and torn flesh was the only verdict. Their hands served the law, yet their shadows held every unspoken cruelty that people pretended not to see. No honor ever waited for the one who held the whip, only silence that pushed them further into the margins of history. There were corners of medieval towns where punishment did not wait for a judge because there was no judge to begin with. People lived with the understanding that a swing of a whip could decide what happened next, and the man holding it did not speak or question anything. He simply stood where the authorities placed him, facing whoever had been dragged beneath the dim light of a torch, and carried out what everyone else called justice. It was a routine that settled into the fabric of daily life, where the sound of leather cutting through the air mixed with murmurs from the crowd, forming another common noise in a place already harsh and unkind. No one stayed to remember names because names offered a kind of dignity that this role never received. Most punishments occurred in narrow alleys or small squares near the marketplace, places where people walked past without slowing their pace. The man with the whip waited there before sunrise, wearing clothes that always seemed worn from too many mornings, just like this one. The guards brought offenders tied at the wrists, sometimes trembling, and sometimes resigned, and left them standing in front of him. There was no need for a conversation, no exchange of explanations or defense. His task began the same way each time, and it ended in the same silence. Even the crowd behaved predictably, gathering only long enough to watch the first few lashes before drifting away again, as if punished flesh no longer held their attention once the first drops of blood appeared. He did not look directly at the people he struck, because that was a rule given to him on his first day. The belief was that meeting their eyes could weaken his resolve or create sympathy, and neither was permitted in a system built on fear rather than fairness. So he looked at the ground at the wall behind them, or at the whip in his own hand. The distance in his gaze allowed him to continue doing what others expected, even when the cries echoed longer than anyone cared to hear. The pain belonged to the punished, but the memory of it clung to him like a stain he could not wash away. Payment for this work rarely came in the form of coins. Sometimes he received bread, a jug of cheap wine, or leftovers from the guardhouse. He accepted whatever was given, because no one else would offer him a place to work or a way to feed himself. People avoided speaking to him, unless necessary, and when he walked through the streets, they stepped aside just enough to let him pass without acknowledging him. They feared him, but they also believed he carried something unclean. Even children were told not to stand too close, as if cruelty was something that could be transmitted through the air. Night brought no comfort. He spent most evenings alone, sitting outside a small shed near the outskirts of town, listening to the faint noise of distant conversations he never joined. The whip lay beside him, coiled neatly, waiting for morning. Sleep did not come easily, because the cries he heard during the day replayed each night, slowly stretching into thoughts he could not silence. The work ate away at whatever softness remained in him, leaving behind a shell that functioned well enough to follow orders but struggled to feel anything beyond numb acceptance. In time, he noticed that people treated him as part of the punishment system rather than a man. To them, he was simply another tool, no different from the wooden post or the iron chains. Even the guards avoided giving him their names. His presence reminded them of a cruelty they helped enforce, and distancing themselves allowed them to pretend they were not part of it. As seasons changed, his hands grew calloused, and the skin on his face hardened under constant exposure to sun, rain, and the weight of other people's suffering. The town changed in small ways, but his role did not. He understood that no one would remember him once he stopped working. There would be no stories told about him, no grave marked with a stone, no sign of gratitude from the people whose order he helped maintain. The whip did not grant honor. It took whatever remained of a man and replaced it with a duty that demanded obedience without reward. Yet he continued, because not continuing meant starvation, homelessness, and disappearance into an even darker edge of society. This was survival, reduced to its barest form. Each morning he walked to the square again, listening to the quiet steps of his own feet. The world around him stirred with ordinary life, merchants lifting their stalls, bakers kneading dough, farmers unloading produce. His life never changed in the same way theirs did. Routine wrapped itself around him until he no longer questioned what he had become. The whip remained the center of everything, and he followed its demands as predictably as the sun rose each day. This part shows how punishment replaced justice in the daily rhythm of a medieval town. It leads toward the next story about those who tasted danger on behalf of the powerful. Someone waited for poison meant for another, and their fate slipped quietly into the shadows. There were roles in medieval courts that existed quietly in the background, overshadowed by the presence of kings, nobles, guards, and servants. Yet they carried risks far greater than anyone else in the room. A herb taster usually sat close enough to the banquet table to reach the goblets and bowls before they were served, but far enough that no one felt compelled to acknowledge him. His purpose was simple: taste what others feared. The food arrived, arranged on silver trays, and the wine reflected the color of the torches on the wall. But nothing in that setting belonged to him. He touched each dish, knowing it might be the last thing he ever consumed. The work did not require special training. He learned not by instruction, but by watching others before him collapse to the floor with little warning. The court rarely paused when a taster died. A few servants dragged the body away, the spilled wine was wiped clean, and the noble who had been waiting continued, as though the interruption were no more significant than a gust of wind. The herb taster understood this rhythm early in his service. His existence held value only in the moments before the noble lifted a cup. After that, he blended back into the anonymous part of the hall. Meals followed a predictable structure. He stepped forward, received a small amount of the dish, and waited under the silent gaze of the guards. They counted the minutes carefully. The delay between tasting and reaction became its own measure of safety. If his breathing remained steady, if no discoloration spread across his skin, if he did not clutch his stomach or fall to his knees, then the meal was considered safe enough for the table. The noble rarely looked at him directly, because looking made the danger too real, and recognizing danger threatened the illusion of control they needed to maintain. Some days, he tasted more than a dozen dishes, stews thick with herbs, roasted meats, fruit soaked in wine, and potions prepared by court physicians. He felt the weight of every swallow. Poison came in many forms, and he could never predict which sensation belonged to the food itself, and which belonged to the danger hidden inside it. A bitterness might be natural. It might also be the first sign of something irreversible. His heartbeat often quickened even when nothing was wrong, because constant anticipation blurred the boundary between fear and instinct. Nights were worse. After each meal, he returned to a small chamber near the kitchens, lying awake with a tightness in his chest that never fully disappeared. The work created a constant uncertainty that left him unable to rest deeply. He listened to the muffled noises of boiling pots, footsteps, and low conversations, wondering each time whether he would wake again. Servants who passed by rarely greeted him, not out of cruelty, but because they believed forming attachments to him invited sorrow. Most tasters did not survive long, and the court adapted by distancing itself emotionally from those who occupied the role. He received a modest payment, barely enough to buy simple clothing or basic food to sustain himself outside the hall. No wealth accompanied the work despite the risk, because the nobles saw him not as a guardian of their safety, but as a buffer between themselves and unseen threats. He prevented deaths without ever being thanked for it. In fact, some courtiers even blamed tasters for the presence of poison, as though danger existed because someone had been assigned to detect it. He carried these judgments silently, adding them to the weight of his work. The taster learned to observe people. He noticed when a physician avoided eye contact, or when a servant handled a dish with trembling hands. He watched nobles feud quietly during meals, understanding that danger often grew from resentment hidden beneath polite words. His life depended on reading the room accurately. Sometimes he sensed tension in the air long before the food arrived, and these moments reminded him that poison was not always meant for the king alone. Many nobles had enemies who preferred subtlety over confrontation. There were times he felt the beginnings of sickness after tasting something. His limbs grew heavy, his breathing uneven, and the guards stiffened, preparing for the possibility that he would not stand much longer. When he recovered, he returned to work the next day, because no alternative existed. The court replaced tasters quickly, and losing his role meant losing access to shelter and food. He remained because survival offered fewer choices than people imagined. He understood this reality with a calm that came only from long exposure to danger. The worst moments came during celebrations. Large feasts meant more dishes and more opportunities for someone to attempt harm. Laughter filled the hall, while the taster swallowed risk after risk alone in the center of a room where no one truly saw him. Musicians played, dancers performed, and nobles toasted one another with bright smiles. Meanwhile, he measured every muscle in his body for signs of failure. Living between life and death was not poetic in any way. It was a slow grind that hollowed a person from within. Nothing about his work left a legacy. When he died, the court did not mark the day. Another taster stepped into place, wearing a similar expression of resignation. His belongings were minimal, and his memory faded before the next feast began. Yet every safe meal, every uninterrupted banquet, every uneventful evening existed partly because he had tasted danger first. The court would never admit it, but their comfort came from a life they quietly expected him to lose. This part shows a life reduced to swallowing danger so others could dine without fear. It guides us toward another fate shaped by royal power and silent suffering. There was another figure who absorbed the consequences meant for a prince carrying a different kind of cruelty in his shadow. The role grew out of a belief that royal blood was too sacred to be touched, so every punishment intended for a young prince fell onto another child whose only purpose was to absorb pain that did not belong to him. The arrangement appeared orderly to those who lived inside palaces, a simple solution to discipline a future king without violating the rules imposed by lineage. It was considered practical and even necessary, though anyone standing quietly near those lessons could see how much brutality hid behind the calm surface of royal education. These boys were chosen early, often when they were still too young to understand why they were singled out. They lived close to the prince, studied beside him, ate in the same room, and sometimes shared tutors. Their presence was meant to encourage good behavior by binding punishment to friendship. If the prince misbehaved, the lash fell on the boy beside him. It was an emotional leash disguised as companionship. The palace considered the arrangement clever, but the weight of it became clear in every lesson, where silence echoed after each strike. The whipping boy was expected to stand still regardless of the pain. He was not permitted to cry out too loudly, because doing so could embarrass the prince. He was not allowed to shield himself, because it would imply defiance. He was not supposed to break down, because fragility made the system harder to maintain. The goal was to absorb each blow without resistance, shaping him into a tool rather than a child. The tutors overseeing these punishments rarely questioned the cruelty, because the structure had existed for generations. Tradition made the violence acceptable, and acceptance turned it into routine. His injuries could last for days, sometimes weeks. The bruises darkened and spread, his ribs ached when he breathed, and the skin on his back stiffened under repeated strikes. Servants helped him clean the wounds only when ordered, and even then, their gestures were rushed. They believed he was fortunate to live in the palace, fortunate to receive clothing and food, and fortunate to be close to royalty. Gratitude was expected to outweigh suffering, as if comfort could erase the reality that his life was built on pain that never belonged to him. The prince, in many cases, grew attached to the boy, assigned to suffer in his place. The attachment complicated everything. The prince might feel guilty, or he might feel indifferent, or he might feel a mixture of both that changed from day to day. But regardless of emotion, the system remained intact. When mistakes were made, tutors called the whipping boy forward. When lessons failed, the lash returned. The relationship became a reminder that privilege for one required sacrifice from another. Some boys tried to excel in studies, hoping that good behavior might shield them from punishment, but effort never changed the truth. Their purpose was not to succeed, but to endure. They were taught obedience, humility, and silence. Tutors praised them for restraint, but never kindness. Pain became their curriculum survival, their only achievement. Even on days when no punishment occurred, the tension stayed because the next mistake could happen at any moment. Every misstep made by the prince turned into a burden waiting for them. Many of these boys did not reach adulthood. The repeated injuries weakened their bodies, infections lingered, fevers rose, and the palace rarely invested in medical care for children considered replaceable. When one whipping boy died, another was selected, and the cycle resumed with little acknowledgement. Records hardly mentioned their names. Official documents recorded the progress of the prince, the accomplishments of tutors, and the expectations of the monarchy. But the children who carried suffering on their backs disappeared into the margins. The palace maintained the illusion of order, but the presence of such a role revealed the contradictions inside a system obsessed with purity and authority. By protecting royal blood from discipline, the monarchy relied on another child's sacrifice. This reality was hidden beneath polished halls and ceremonial routines. Visitors saw a controlled and structured environment, unaware of the quiet tragedies unfolding behind doors reserved for lessons. If anyone questioned the ethics of the practice, their concerns were dismissed as misunderstandings of tradition. Occasionally, a whipping boy survived long enough to reach older adolescence. Those who did often carried lasting marks, both physical and emotional. Their bodies showed scars from repeated strikes, and their minds adapted to a life built on caution. They avoided drawing attention, avoiding making noise, and avoiding creating conflict. Some remained in palace service, though rarely in positions of influence. Others were sent away quietly. Their usefulness had expired. Their departure rarely stirred comment. By then, a new child had already taken their place. The existence of whipping boys shaped the princes as well. Some grew resentful of a system that forced their mistakes onto another child. Others learned indifference, accepting the arrangement as a privilege tied to their birth. A few viewed the punishment of another as a reminder of the power they had not yet earned. Each reaction influenced the ruler they would become, though none erased the fact that their rise relied on someone else's endurance. The cruelty embedded in their education often translated into their decisions later in life, shaping laws and expectations in ways that outlasted them. The story of the whipping boy is not a dramatic tale filled with rebellion or escape. It is a quiet account of children molded into instruments for the discipline of kings. It reveals more about the structures that governed medieval life than about any single individual. The survival of the monarchy required sacrifices that were absorbed silently, and the whipping boy stood at the center of that silence. His suffering maintained the image of sacred royal blood, while leaving him with no legacy except the lessons written on his skin. This account lingers as a reminder that discipline within royalty often rested on the body of a child who had no choices of his own. It guides the path toward another profession shaped by darkness, carried through cramped spaces and diseased corners of daily life. Somewhere, in the alleys and cellars of medieval towns, another worker hunted creatures that spread death before anyone noticed their presence. In many medieval towns, the quietest work often happened in the places most people refused to imagine: the narrow floorboards, the dark soil beneath kitchens, and the damp corners of latrines, where waste gathered and air turned heavy. Into those hidden spaces, the rat catcher descended every day, carrying simple tools and a tolerance for conditions that pushed others away. The job called for a willingness to face what the town feared: the movement of rodents that multiplied in shadows, carrying sickness from alley to cellar without pause. While crowds filled markets and children ran across open squares, he moved into the cavities beneath their feet, where only the faint sound of claws marked the passing of time. Most days began with him crouching at the edge of a trapdoor or cellar entrance, lowering a lantern and breathing in the stale air rising from below. The dim light barely cut through the darkness, forcing him to work more by sound and instinct than by sight. Scurrying noises echoed around him, guiding his hands toward hiding spots carved into wooden beams or the small holes chewed through stone foundations. As he crawled deeper into narrow passages, the space pressed against his shoulders, the floor scraped his knees, and moisture clung to every surface. Each movement demanded caution, because one loud shift of weight could send rats scattering into unreachable spaces, turning a simple task into hours of slow pursuit. Bites came with little warning. A cornered rat lunged without hesitation, sinking teeth into his fingers or the side of his hand before he had time to react. The wounds burned almost immediately, swelling over the next few days. Infection followed unpredictably, sometimes fading, sometimes growing worse until fever forced him to rest. Many rat catchers carried scars from years of these encounters, reminders of the risks taken in spaces no one else would enter. Illness was common and often fatal, yet the work continued because towns expected results, not excuses. Payment arrived in an unusual form. Instead of coins, households often compensated him with the severed tails or heads he returned as proof of each kill. Officials counted them without emotion, turning the number into a measure of success. The sight of him carrying a sack filled with small bodies became familiar in certain streets, though people seldom acknowledged him directly. He performed a service they needed, but preferred not to discuss a contradiction that followed him everywhere. Even when he walked through open squares, the smell of damp wood and waste from the underground spaces lingered on him, creating a distance others rarely crossed. Suspicion occasionally fell on him when the disease spread. People whispered that he brought sickness with him, even though he worked to contain it. Fear made them irrational, especially when illness reached homes and families. Instead of acknowledging the rodents that thrived beneath their floors, some blamed the man who spent the most time fighting them. He learned to ignore these moments, knowing that when the crisis passed, the town would return to its usual silence toward him. Knowledge of rats shaped his daily rhythm. He understood where they traveled, where they nested, and how they followed warmth, grain, and waste. He moved according to their patterns, adjusting his work with seasons and weather. In winter, he found them clustered closer to human homes seeking heat. In summer, He struggled through the stronger smell of rot rising from beneath kitchens and storage rooms. His clothes absorbed the scent of these places, becoming impossible to clean fully. The stench marked him as clearly as a title might mark another man. Despite the harshness, he performed the job with a steadiness formed through repetition. Each crawl into a cellar, each trap set in a dark passage, each return to the surface shaped a routine that guided him through years of work. He rarely spoke of what he endured, and people rarely asked. This silence fit naturally into the structure of medieval towns, where unpleasant labor existed out of sight. Communities relied on such workers, but offered no recognition, allowing them to fade into the background unless a crisis required attention. Isolation became a daily companion. When he visited food markets, vendors served him quickly but avoided conversation. Children watched him with curiosity and fear, sensing the connection between him and the creatures adults warned them about. He did not resent the distance. He accepted it as part of the life shaped by his choices and circumstances. Survival required steady hands and a willingness to step where others would not. These qualities kept him alive, though they placed him apart from the daily warmth shared by others. With each passing year, the rat catcher continued navigating the hidden layers beneath the town, understanding that his efforts kept food supplies, safer kitchens, more orderly, and disease at least slightly contained. His success left no visible signs. When rats decreased, townspeople forgot the danger. When rats returned, and they always did, he descended again into the dark, repeating the cycle in a world that counted his work but rarely counted him. This account reveals a life shaped by shadows that most people tried to ignore. It moves toward another story built around labor nobody wished to acknowledge yet depended on for survival. In the next role, a worker would carry waste instead of rodents facing rejection, while sustaining the very fields that fed the town. Work that existed far below the edges of medieval respectability often began before sunrise, when most people still slept, and the streets remained quiet enough to conceal movements others chose not to witness. The dung collector walked these early paths carrying his tools, usually a wooden scraper, a bucket, and a cart with wheels that creaked under the weight of long use. His task was simple in definition, but heavy in reality. He gathered human and animal waste from alleys, stables, and latrines, collecting what towns produced without pause. The substance he carried repelled everyone else, yet fields outside the walls depended on it to stay fertile. His labor fed harvests, and harvests fed the town, though few cared to acknowledge the connection. Most stops along his route were predictable. Stables offered piles that steamed in the cool morning air, and he worked through them steadily, pushing them into his bucket before they cooled. He did the same near pig pens behind taverns and beside homes with open gutters. Each movement stirred odors that clung to him throughout the day. No matter how slowly he breathed, the smell settled into his clothes and skin, creating a barrier between him and the rest of society. People accepted his presence only when necessary, keeping their distance, even as they relied on the service he provided. Human waste came from designated pits or simple wooden seats placed over shallow holes. He approached these spots carefully, scraping away layers of waste with practiced movements. The work produced immediate discomfort, but he focused on efficiency, knowing the task needed to be completed before crowds filled the streets. Handling waste exposed him to illness and infection daily. His hands developed sores that never fully healed, and the skin around his wrists cracked from constant contact with moisture and bacteria. Infections spread along cuts, turning small wounds into lasting pain that no herbal wash could truly soothe. Despite the hardship, he understood the value of what he collected. Farmers waited outside the town walls with sacks or barrels ready to purchase the waste for their fields. It served as fertilizer, renewing soil that would otherwise grow weak from repeated planting. Without it, harvests risked failure. Without harvests, the town risked hunger. His work operated quietly at the foundation of survival, yet he never received acknowledgement beyond a quick exchange of coins. People preferred not to picture the origin of the material that nourished their food. The cart grew heavier as the morning progressed. He pushed it along narrow streets, avoiding areas where wealthier families lived. They complained if he passed too closely, unwilling to let the smell drift near their windows. Markets forbade him from entering, even when he needed to cross through to reach another part of town. Guards turned him away, instructing him to find alternate routes. Public spaces welcomed everyone except the man whose labor kept the soil fertile. The rule became instinctive for him. Avoid crowds, avoid gatherings, Avoid places where laughter and conversation filled the air. Food was purchased on the outskirts where vendors tolerated him, as long as he finished transactions quickly. Some handed him goods without speaking, eyes lowered, trying to shorten the moment. Others stepped back while he counted coins, careful not to inhale too deeply. He carried no resentment. He had learned long ago that people feared what the work represented, and he accepted their distance as part of the life he inhabited. What mattered was that he could buy enough to survive another day, despite the limitations imposed on him. The smell shaped every aspect of his existence. Cloth washed in cold water could not erase it. Soap, when available, made little difference. When he sat alone outside his small dwelling at night, the odor remained around him like a boundary he could not cross. Even animals avoided him. Children pointed from a distance but never approached. He grew accustomed to silence, spending evenings in thought rather than conversation. Loneliness settled into his routine as firmly as the work itself. Diseases spread easily among those in his trade. Constant exposure to bacteria led to fevers that flared without warning. Some dung collectors collapsed during their routes, unable to continue. When they died, new workers stepped in quickly because the job needed to be filled. The town relied on a steady cycle of laborers who accepted pay in exchange for health risks most considered unbearable. There was no ceremony, no recognition, only the practical need to keep waste moving out of sight. The dung collector knew this reality well. He worked with steadiness shaped by necessity, pushing through discomfort to complete each day's route. Early mornings turned into long afternoons of sorting, scraping, and transporting waste to waiting buyers outside the walls. His world remained small but consistent, measured by the weight of his cart and the distance between one pit and the next. He carried no illusions about respect or honor. What he carried was the foundation of fields and crops, a silent contribution to a town that avoided his gaze. Yet he continued understanding that without his labor, others would face consequences far worse than discomfort. Waste would pile along streets, disease would spread more rapidly, and fields would lose the strength to produce grain. His work supported a fragile balance, invisible but essential. Each step he took reinforced a cycle that sustained life, even if no one spoke of him once he passed. This account shows how a town relied on the hands it refused to welcome. It leads into another truth shaped by labor that sustained life while receiving only rejection. There was a role that carried the burden of feeding the land, yet society treated its workers as refuse. Daily life in medieval towns depended on countless routines that most people never questioned and few considered, where the foundation of their food supply truly came from. Behind the fields that produced grain and vegetables, behind the orchards that yielded fruit, and behind the livestock that fed entire seasons, stood a quiet workforce that moved through streets before others woke. These workers collected the waste that fertilized the land, transforming what towns rejected into strength for the coming harvests. Their contribution fed every household, yet their presence remained unwelcome everywhere they went. The contradiction shaped their entire existence. Most people avoided thinking about the process at all. They bought vegetables in markets, accepted grain in sacks, and prepared meals without acknowledging the unseen labor that made these products possible. The individuals who collected human and animal waste worked in the earliest hours, scraping and lifting material that others refused even to glance at. They moved quickly along alleys, staying close to walls, guiding their carts through the quietest paths to avoid attention. Their work was necessary, but their presence was treated like a disturbance. Each morning confirmed the same truth: what sustained life could be handled only by people society pushed aside. These workers endured physical hardships that marked their bodies permanently. Skin exposed to waste developed sores dripping with slow infections that never fully resolved. Their hands cracked from repeated contact with corrosive moisture. Legs and feet remained swollen from long hours, pushing carts heavier than most could imagine. The smell followed them everywhere, settling into their hair, clothes, and skin. People recoiled from it, even when the workers kept a distance. The odor acted like a line drawn around them, a line no one else crossed willingly. Despite the rejection, they understood the value of what they carried. Farmers waited just beyond the city walls for the material that enriched their soil. Without fertilizer, crops weakened, harvests diminished, and shortages followed. Waste offered nutrients the land needed to recover each season. The workers saw this cycle clearly, even when others pretended not to notice. Still, knowledge brought no comfort. Their role remained unspoken, hidden behind the rhythm of daily life that depended on their presence but denied them respect. Markets shut their gates to them, refusing entry even when they needed food or supplies. Taverns turned them away before they could step through the doorway. Public gatherings dispersed slightly when one of them approached people, shifting positions as though distance alone could erase discomfort. Children pointed at them from afar, but adults pulled them close, warning them to stay silent. The boundaries imposed on these workers spread across the entire town, creating a life marked by isolation. They learned to move quietly, to take up little space, and to pass unnoticed whenever possible. Yet their absence would be noticed immediately. Without them, waste would pile in alleys, contaminating water and attracting pests that spread disease. Fields would fail within a season or two, leaving communities hungry. The link between their labor and the community's survival was undeniable, but no one wanted to acknowledge it openly. Towns valued results, not the people who produced them. The workers became invisible in conversation, dismissed in public, and forgotten once their daily routes ended. The greatest cruelty lay in how easily they were replaced. When sickness struck, and it often did, another person stepped into the role with little ceremony. The town accepted the substitution as naturally as it accepted the rising sun. Death did not disrupt the system. New hands arrived, ready to carry the burden that others refused. No graves bore titles indicating their trade. No records mentioned their names. Generations of workers lived and died in anonymity, supplying the foundation of survival without leaving traces behind. Their lives held no promise of advancement. The job offered no path toward acceptance, no possibility of earning trust or status. The smell that marked them never left long enough to allow any meaningful interaction with others. They lived on the outskirts geographically and socially, occupying spaces near waste pits, stables, or fields where their materials were processed. Their dwellings remained small, isolated structures with little more than basic tools and clothing. Evenings passed quietly, without companionship or celebration. Whatever strength they found came from endurance rather than hope. Still, they continued working each day, moving steadily through routines that kept the town functioning. They lifted, scraped, carried, and delivered waste, with practiced movement guided by necessity rather than pride. If they paused, the consequences for the entire community would appear quickly. Disease would spread, crops would weaken, and hunger would return. Their work supported the very framework that allowed others to live comfortably. But acknowledgement never arrived, neither during their lives nor after their deaths. They carried responsibility without recognition, and society allowed the pattern to continue without interruption. This reality shaped an unspoken truth about medieval life. Survival depended on people pushed into darkness, tasked with handling what others discarded. Their contribution remained hidden, yet their absence would have dragged entire towns into crisis. While others walked streets lined with food stalls and full baskets, these workers walked paths littered with waste. Knowing that what they carried would eventually feed the people who avoided them, they belonged to a world that needed them, but never welcomed them. A world that consumed the results of their labor, while denying them dignity. This part reveals a life sustained by labor that others refuse to acknowledge. It brings us toward another figure who moved through nights filled with loss and quiet echoes. There was someone whose duty spread news of death, with each toll carrying sorrow through every darkened street. Night in a medieval town carried a quiet that felt heavier than the darkness itself, broken only by wind slipping between roofs or the occasional footsteps of someone returning home late. In that stillness, one sound rose above everything, a slow, deliberate toll of metal echoing across empty streets. The dead bell ringer stood alone beneath a small wooden tower, pulling the rope that announced another death. The sound spread into every corner of the town, waking light sleepers and reminding them that life had ended somewhere nearby. For the ringer, it was a familiar rhythm repeated on nights when others rested, shaping a life built around loss rather than comfort. His home stood close to the graveyard, a modest structure with thin walls that let the cold seep in year-round. From his doorway he could see fresh burial mounds forming uneven rows across the ground. Each grave carried a different story, though he never knew them fully. What he understood was the weight of hearing families cry at any hour, their grief filling the air long after the bell stopped ringing. The sounds became part of the landscape of his life, shaping evenings that stretched on without relief. People believed he grew accustomed to it, but the truth was quieter and less forgiving. The cries settled into him until they felt permanent. Every toll required accuracy. The number of rings signaled who had died, child, adult, or elder. Tradition demanded strict timing. Death held a formal structure in the town, and the bell ringer maintained it even when exhaustion blurred the edges of his vision. He woke at the slightest knock on his door, rising from bed, with movements practiced from years of repetition. Families came to him quietly, speaking only enough to share the news. Though they avoided looking directly at him, they relied on him to honor their loss through the bell's steady rhythm. He knew his role mattered, even if no one said the words aloud. The work shaped his nights more than his days. Rest rarely came in long stretches. He slept in short intervals, always half aware that another call might arrive. Over time, this pattern carved deep shadows beneath his eyes and left him with a heaviness in his limbs. Some mornings, he walked slowly to the edge of the graveyard, feeling the weight of accumulated sorrow pressing against his chest. His life moved according to death's timing, leaving him disconnected from the rhythms that guided others. He did not attend markets, feasts, or gatherings. The bell tower became his anchor, and the graveyard his constant backdrop. Living so close to death changed how people treated him. Many avoided passing near his home, believing the presence of so many corpses left something unsettling in the air. Some whispered that the bell ringer carried misfortune, that spending nights beside graves drew shadows toward him. Even those who relied on his service maintained a distance during daylight. He became a figure people saw only when they needed him, stepping back into silence the moment he finished his duty. The separation was not hostile. It was instinctive, born from fear of what he represented. Isolation deepened with each passing year. He ate alone, walked alone, and listened to the sounds of mourning alone. Night after night, the bells ringing continued, and the emotions tied to each death clung to him. Over time, many bell ringers developed a quiet despair, shaped by years of witnessing grief, without being part of the community that experienced it. Some struggled with sleeplessness that never improved. Others drowned in their own thoughts, losing the ability to distinguish one death from another. The stories of bell ringers dying young from melancholy or slipping into madness circulated across towns, though people rarely discussed them openly. The physical toll also lingered. Climbing the narrow steps to the bell tower placed a strain on his joints. Pulling the rope repeatedly wore the skin on his hands until calluses formed and reopened. Cold nights stiffened his muscles until movement required effort. Even so, he continued, knowing that stopping meant leaving a town without the ritual it depended on. The bell had to ring, and someone had to ring it. The role passed through generations of quiet workers, each inheriting the weight of the duty without changing its nature. Despite everything, the bell ringer never failed to respond. When footsteps approached his home, when a trembling knock signaled loss, he rose. He lit his lantern, walked through the night air, and climbed into the tower. The bell swung with a rhythm he controlled, steady and measured. Families listened from doorways, knowing the sound marked the beginning of mourning. The town listened from beds, acknowledging mortality without speaking of it. His work gave shape to grief, transforming silence into a sound that every resident recognized. Mourning brought little relief. He swept the tower floor, checked the rope for wear, and walked through the graveyard to ensure nothing had been disturbed overnight. Even during daylight, the reminder of death stayed close. He had no refuge from it, no corner of the town untouched by his responsibilities. The tolls echoed even after they stopped filling his thoughts, through meals and restless attempts at sleep. Life continued for others. For him, it paused each time the bell rang, and resumed only in the brief intervals between deaths. Yet he persisted because the ritual mattered. The town needed someone to acknowledge death with structure and steadiness. Each toll served as a final act of recognition for a life that ended, even if the ringer himself faded into obscurity. His task preserved dignity for the lost, even as his own life slipped quietly into monotony and solitude. This part reflects a life shaped by sorrow, repeated through countless nights. It brings us toward another figure who faced disease directly, wielding a blade against what others feared to touch. In the next account, a worker pierced swollen flesh during plague years, stepping into danger with every movement. During plague years, towns changed in ways that made even the most familiar streets feel foreign. Houses closed their shutters, markets fell silent, and the air carried the heavy stillness of fear. In this environment, a certain kind of worker moved through neighborhoods that others avoided with absolute certainty. The boil lancer approached homes, marked by sickness, carrying only a small knife, a cloth, and a lantern that flickered against walls, stained by days of despair. His task was simple in description, yet severe in consequence. He pierced swollen buboes on plague victims, releasing infected fluid in an attempt to give the sick a chance to breathe for another day. The work took him into dim rooms, where bodies lay curled under blankets, trembling with fever. The stench of illness lingered in every corner, mixing with sweat and the sharp odor of rotting infection. Buboes bulged beneath the skin, dark and hot to the touch, each one filled with fluid that could spill at the slightest pressure. The lancer knelt beside the patient, steadying his hand before pressing the blade into the swollen mass. It burst with a thick, putrid release that splattered onto cloths already stained from earlier visits. Some patients groaned, others did not respond at all. The act was quick, but the risk it carried stretched far beyond the moment. He understood that every cut placed him closer to death. The fluid he handled spread infection with ease. A splash, a scrape, or a cut on his own skin could be enough to seal his fate. Many lancers worked only a few weeks before falling ill themselves, collapsing into the same beds where they had lanced dozens of buboes. The disease took them quickly, leaving behind little more than a set of tools that another desperate laborer picked up. The cycle continued without ceremony, because plague created needs that towns could not ignore. Most boil lancers took the role because they had no other choice. Poverty made decisions for them. They lived in cramped housing, relied on uncertain wages, and often had families depending on them. When plague swept through the town, other jobs disappeared, but demand for lancers grew. Authorities pressured the poorest, offering small payments that barely supported survival. Refusal came with consequences, sometimes fines, and sometimes imprisonment. Acceptance meant stepping into danger each day, holding a blade that offered no protection from what it released. The toll on the body grew quickly. Breathing in air thick with infection weakened the lungs. Touching sick flesh caused constant irritation on the skin. The smell of bursting buboes clung to clothes and hair, a reminder of work that never truly left. Hands shook after long hours, not from fear, but from exhaustion that intensified with each passing day. Sleep brought little relief. Nightmares filled the brief moments of rest, replaying scenes of swollen limbs and collapsing patients. Waking offered no comfort, only the knowledge that another round of visits awaited. The emotional burden settled deeper. Families watched as he entered their homes, standing helpless near the door, while he knelt beside loved ones. Some looked at him with hope, others with resignation. He saw expressions that stayed with him, eyes begging for relief, eyes already fading, eyes filled with guilt for being unable to pay more. He learned not to linger on these moments, because doing so made the work heavier. Still, the memories followed him, attaching themselves to each step he took through the streets. People avoided him during daylight. Even when his route required passing through public areas, crowds shifted aside quietly. They feared he carried the infection with him, and in many cases they were right. No one welcomed him into shops or taverns. He purchased food from a distance, placing coins on a stone and waiting for the vendor to step forward, only after he backed away. Children stayed indoors when they saw him approaching. Adults lowered their eyes as he passed. Isolation formed a barrier that no amount of endurance could break. When plague intensified, the lancer worked without pause. He moved from house to house, guided by pleas that reached him through windows, or by word of mouth from neighbors, too frightened to approach the sick directly. The lantern he carried cast unsteady light, marking his presence in streets otherwise emptied by fear. Each time he entered a home, he confronted suffering without any promise of improvement. The treatment he provided offered only a chance, a fragile possibility that the patient might endure another day. Many did not. Despite the grimness, he continued, because stopping meant abandoning those with no one else to turn to. Physicians avoided most homes, preferring to treat only those who could afford their care. Neighbors stepped back, unwilling to risk infection. The lancer became the only line of contact between sickness and any attempt at relief. He performed his task without expectation of gratitude, because gratitude rarely came. The moment the patient died, families often blamed him, believing his blade hastened the end. When a patient survived, they credited prayer or luck. His role existed in a space where merit rarely mattered. Even as he worked, he understood that his life would likely end the same way as those he treated, struggling to breathe with a fever burning through his body. That knowledge did not stop him. It simply shaped the quiet tone of his days. Each sunrise brought more doors to knock, on more swollen flesh to cut, and more reminders that survival depended not on health, but on the endurance to face what others feared. This part reflects a life spent at the edge of disease where duty overshadowed self-preservation. It leads toward another figure who walked in the aftermath of violence rather than illness. A different worker moved across battlefields, collecting what war left behind, carrying silence through places shaped by death. When battles ended and soldiers marched away, the landscape they left behind no longer resembled the fields that once stretched quietly across the countryside. Grass lay flattened under boots, and blood soil mixed with ash, and the silence felt heavier than the clash of weapons that had filled the air only hours before. Into this aftermath walked the battlefield cleaner, a figure who belonged to neither side, but carried the responsibility of restoring order where death had settled. His work began only when the fighting stopped, revealing truths that soldiers did not stay long enough to witness. The first task was to gather the bodies. Some lay in clear view, fallen where they had collapsed. Others rested half hidden in tall grass, trenches or ditches where they crawled in their final moments. The cleaner approached each one with deliberate steps, lifting limbs stiffened by cold or heat, arranging them onto carts, pulled slowly across uneven ground. The weight of the dead pressed into his arms and shoulders, but the task left no room for hesitation. He worked until the field held no more movement, knowing that leaving remains behind meant attracting animals' further decay and disease that would reach settlements nearby. Weapons scattered across the field required collection as well. Swords, broken spears, bent shields, and abandoned helmets lay beside pools of dried blood. Some pieces still held warmth from the hands that had dropped them. The cleaner sorted them into piles, separating what could be repaired from what needed to be melted down. Soldiers rarely looked back at these remnants, yet the cleaner handled them with care, knowing that careless disposal could wound someone or poison the soil with rust and fragments. His work was not just retrieval but prevention, ensuring the violence of the battle did not extend into the days that followed. The ground itself demanded attention. Blood soaked into the earth, forming dark stains that drew insects from every direction. Flies swarmed thickly over exposed wounds, and maggots multiplied faster than he could keep track. The cleaner knelt with a bucket of water, scrubbing stones and wooden barricades, letting water run red before clearing it again. The smell clung to him, strong, metallic, and unrelenting. No amount of washing removed it fully. Over time, it became part of him, marking him as someone who worked where others refused to stand. Moving through the battlefield exposed him to hazards left behind. Bones snapped underfoot with muted cracks, arrows buried in the ground, pierced hands if lifted carelessly. Fire pits that once fueled siege engines smoldered quietly, releasing heat that could burn skin without warning. The cleaner learned to navigate these dangers with a calm steadiness. He used long poles to probe uncertain areas, clearing debris layer by layer. Each step required caution, not because he feared injury, but because injury meant losing work, and losing work meant losing the only place society allowed him. Soldiers viewed him with disdain. To them, the battlefield belonged to warriors, not cleaners. They saw his work as a stain rather than a necessity, a task beneath their effort. Some mocked him as they passed, calling attention to his grimy covered clothes or the smell that followed him. Others ignored him completely, as if acknowledging his presence might reduce their own standing. He had no side in the conflict, no loyalty to banners or crowns. His allegiance was to the aftermath, the space where suffering settled, once swords stopped clashing. Yet he continued because someone needed to. Without him, the field would remain a site of decay, threatening nearby villages with sickness and rot. Animals would scatter remains across farmlands, and rain would wash contaminated soil into rivers. His work preserved life, even as he walked through the ruins of death. He understood this, even if no one spoke of it, even if no one thanked him. Medieval societies relied on quiet labor, performed by those they overlooked, and his role embodied that truth more clearly than most. The emotional toll accumulated gradually. The silent faces of the dead, frozen in expressions shaped by fear or determination, stayed with him. He saw the bodies of young men who had marched out with confidence only hours earlier. He saw soldiers from opposing sides lying inches apart, the conflict that separated them, erased by the moment they both fell. He moved past these scenes with practiced steadiness, but the images settled into him nonetheless, resurfacing at night when the world grew quiet. Though he worked in open fields, loneliness surrounded him. No one joined him in his tasks, and few approached him after he completed them. Evenings found him walking back to the outskirts of town, carrying tools caked with mud and dried blood. People stepped aside when he passed, recognizing the smell and the stains. His dwelling stood far from the marketplace, away from homes and gatherings. Solitude formed the boundaries of his days, as essential as the work itself. As seasons changed, so did the nature of the battlefields. Summer heat accelerated decay, making each task more urgent. The winter cold froze bodies in rigid shapes that required force to move. Rain turned the soil into thick mud that swallowed weapons and limbs alike. The cleaner adapted to each challenge, accepting the shifts as part of the life he had chosen, or the life that had chosen him through circumstance. Survival meant endurance, and endurance became instinct. Despite everything, he worked with consistency that defined him. He arrived after the battles ended, stayed until the ground held no more reminders of violence, and left without ceremony. His presence shaped the transition between war and peace, even if no one spoke his name. He carried the burden silently, knowing that the world moved on because someone remained to tend to what war left behind. This part reveals a life shaped by the weight of battle's aftermath, rather than the clash itself. It leads toward the final truth about those whose names vanished before memory could hold them. Another account waits at the edge of the story, describing workers forgotten, even as they carried the consequences of victory. Tonight comes to you slowly, the way quiet arrives after a long day of wandering through stories that once belonged to distant centuries. You have followed the path of forgotten workers, unseen figures, and quiet hands that shaped the edges of history without expecting their names to remain. Now the journey settles, and the world around you drifts into stillness. This closing moment is here to wrap the day, gently giving your thoughts a place to rest. As you settle into a comfortable position, the weight of everything you have heard begins to soften. The sounds of the outside world fade one by one, leaving only the steady rhythm of your own breath. This is the time when the past steps back, allowing you to return to yourself. There is no hurry now, no need to hold on to anything. The night supports you with a calm presence, asking nothing in return. You may feel your eyelids growing heavier as the minutes pass. This is natural. After walking through old stories, it is normal for the mind to let go and drift. The medieval world was full of noise, duty, and unseen burdens, but none of those responsibilities belong to you. You are here simply to rest. Let each breath slow down, becoming softer and deeper. Feel how your body understands this rhythm and follows it without effort. The darkness outside is gentle tonight. It carries no fear, only quiet. It gives you room to put down whatever you still carry from the day. Thoughts that felt sharp earlier now seem distant. Problems that demanded attention now lose their urgency. The night is patient. It allows everything to loosen at its own pace. This softness is here for you, ready to let you drift as far as your mind needs. As you breathe, imagine the stories you listened to, forming a small circle around you, not to disturb but to settle. Each figure you encountered fades into calm. Their hardships are no longer heavy. Their silence no longer feels cold. They simply rest in the distance, and their stories close themselves gently. You do not need to remember every detail. Your mind will keep only what feels light, and the rest can fall away. Your shoulders may drop a little more now. The muscles in your face may release tension you did not realize you were holding. Your hands rest easily. Your breathing deepens. This is the body's way of saying it is ready to let sleep take over. There is nothing more you need to do. Let the night carry you forward, with a slow, steady pull that asks for no effort, only acceptance. The quiet around you grows wider. Even your thoughts begin to move more slowly. They drift in and out like soft shapes, never staying long, never needing to be solved. This is the moment where rest becomes natural. Some thoughts may linger, but they no longer push. They no longer ask. They simply float. Allow them to come and go without holding on to any of them. The night does not judge what stays or leaves. It welcomes everything lightly. Your breath remains steady. In, out, calm, soft, easy. The rhythm stays with you, forming a quiet thread that guides your mind into deeper rest. Each second lengthens a little more. Each breath settles a little deeper. The world becomes simpler. Your body becomes heavier in a pleasant way, anchored gently to the place where you rest. You may feel a sense of warmth spreading through your chest, or a sense of coolness settling around you. Both are welcome. Both are signs that your body is finding its own comfort. Let the feeling support you. Feel how the bed or chair beneath you holds all your weight, allowing you to release what remains. You do not have to carry anything into the night. It will wait for you until morning. The story of forgotten workers now comes to its quiet end. They survived their world, so you could listen from yours. Their burdens belong to them, not to you. Now those burdens dissolve into the distance. You can release them completely. Their stories return to the past, where they will remain until the next time someone calls for them. But tonight, they no longer need your attention. Tonight is for your rest. If your eyes are not yet closed, they may begin to flutter. If they are already closed, the darkness behind them may feel deeper and calmer. Thoughts continue to soften. Sounds fade. Your breath sinks into its natural pace. You are preparing to step into sleep without noticing the exact moment it happens. This is how restful nights begin quietly without effort. You have listened long enough. You have absorbed enough. Now your mind deserves gentleness. Allow the weight of the day to loosen like a slow tide. Everything you have done is enough. Everything you have learned is enough. The night does not ask for perfection. It only asks for presence and softness. Let it guide you. As you lie here, the boundary between waking and sleeping becomes thin. It blurs gently like a curtain slowly closing. You do not need to push through it. Just let it lower at its own pace. Your breath continues. Your body rests. Your thoughts dim like fading lights. Sleep comes when it is ready, often sooner than you expect. If a few thoughts still wander, let them wander without chasing them. They will dissolve as your mind drifts deeper. The night knows how to quiet them for you. Trust that you are already moving toward rest, even if you are still aware of your surroundings. The process is natural. It does not require your control. The darkness becomes comfortable now. It holds you the way a quiet room holds its own stillness. Nothing presses on you. Nothing pulls you away. You are allowed to release everything. Feel how your breathing continues to settle slower, now softer, almost like a whisper. You are close to sleep, very close. As this closing message reaches its gentle end, let your body sink into stillness. Let your mind drift wherever it wishes. Let your breath guide you into the night. You are safe. You are calm. You are ready for rest. May sleep come to you softly. May your night be peaceful. May your dreams be light and quiet. Good night. Rest well.